the seagulls follow the troll, it's because they think sardines will be thrown into the sea. Thank you.
And as we say now in my country, they brought the buzz and they left the buzz in front of the goal.
And the guy's talking absolute nonsense. Never heard so much rubbish in my life.
Normal men.
What do you mean, normal men?
We're just innocent men.
I'm telling you, don't back down, double down. Don't back down, double down.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's Friday night, so you know what that means. It's time to do a wee bit of time travelling, time for a bit of retrospective, look back into the archives in Celtic's history, and tonight it is a very, very special player-only, player-focused one, and who better, who bigger? Scott Brown is tonight's player-focused episode, very much in vogue at the moment. We've obviously showed the Hydro coming up, it's Armadillo, Hydro, they're all the same complex anyway. But over the SECC, we'll call it, obviously, with that coming up. Yeah, this is a man who's very much in fashion right now. So thought, yeah, let's get into talk about Scott Brown. There's so much to go over regarding Brown's career, so I'm looking forward to getting into this. And as you can see, things are a bit different tonight. The layout of the bus, obviously Russell's still in the middle of his big move, but don't worry, we've got another boy sitting hands tonight. We've got his brother Jonathan, fresh off a victory on sudden death on Monday night. Jonathan, welcome back aboard the Bustalgia time machine. How you doing tonight, sir?
Yeah, it's good to be back on, Phil. I feel like I'm due Bustalgia a visit. It's been giving me a bit of an assist the last couple of weeks on the old sudden death on the Monday Club. We're now getting a wee bit closer to Russell Boys. I can actually feel the fear coming from Dunfermline before he moves back to Stirling over the weekend. So, yeah, I feel like I was due the show a wee visit tonight, because I'm fully expecting you in your methodical ways to put some sort of Scott Brown trivia into the Monday show. So I'd like to be prepared and do my homework ahead of time this week.
Cover all the bases, mate. You never know. I'll keep you guessing until Monday night. Obviously, the theme has been, I've took inspiration from a recent Bustalgia episode. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. We'll find out soon enough. We will also be joined by a third member of the team tonight. Steve-O is running a little bit late, but he will, as in the wrestling terminology, he will do a run-in at some point. I'm expecting him imminently. And of course, as you may notice as well, the regular on Bustalgia, the wise man of the bus, Liam Greenlaw couldn't make it tonight. Canada's favourite Tim, he's got a meeting he's got to attend tonight. So yeah, it's even though we're a few men down from the usual time travelling team, don't worry, we'll get through this one because yeah, there's plenty to talk about regarding Scott Brown, plenty to digest. So there's no issues there about getting a good 2-hour show out of this one. And of course, before we go any further, I will remind all the viewers again about all that good stuff that helps the channel out massively. So of course, if you only just discovered the Boise Bus, you've been all our lives, why don't you hit that subscribe button? You can keep us in your lives a wee bit longer. Of course, there is the wee bell notification button. Make sure you hit that, and you'll get obviously the notifications when we go live. Obviously, if you're a long time viewer of the bus, hit the like button. Come on, it doesn't take long to do. Helps us out massively, though. YouTube algorithms, and of course, we do enjoy you getting involved in the comments. So tonight, once again, I put a little Bustalgia poll, which will be one of the talking points we've got later tonight, because Scott Brown played for Celtic for 14, 15 years, whatever it worked out at, and he played alongside a lot of good central midfielders. So it was hard to narrow it down to just a few choices, but that will be one of our talking points later on. So tonight I've asked, who's your favourite midfield partner of Scott Brown? I've put Joe Ledley, Victor Wanyama, Callum McGregor, and other as the options. So obviously, drop a wee vote on that. And of course, if you vote for other, let us know who you voted for in the comments. And of course, share the link of the Boise Bus on any good social media platform that you wish. And of course, you can check out piesports.com, our sponsor. Get yourself a nice wee delicious, tasty 12.5% off your order by using Bus 1888 at the checkout as the discount code. And of course, finally, we must once again remind you about the Boise Bus shirt. Now, obviously, Jonathan's wearing a Bumblebee shirt tonight. It is the 2019
Quite that one, no.
Not quite the Boise Bus one, but there is a reason why you're wearing that one, Jonathan. You wish to show the people the back.
Yes, I will do. There's a reason behind this one. We've gone for the Scott Brown shirt because we've got a pretty much appropriate shirt that has been battered and bruised, much like Scott Brown was for much of his career. Yes. So I feel like it was a very appropriate shirt to dig out from the archives for this one. And it was probably about the last time I think I got a player on the back of a shirt. But I'm quite delighted with my choice. In hindsight, it's worked out quite well.
It has, yeah. The old battered name and number is just so appropriate because, you're right. Scott Brown did certainly go through the walls, but he was in the trenches many times. But yeah, regarding Bumblebee shirts, obviously, remember, get your order in for the Boise Bus shirt. Time is now of the essence. Ours are in transit for myself, Jonathan, Steve-O, all the other contributors on the bus. Those are on the way to us at the moment. But yeah, Russell will be putting in the big order soon, so make sure that you get into that. And the instructions are in the description below the video as well. If you just hit the show more button under the video, it will extend the description. And yeah, we've got the how you order it in there through PayPal by contacting Russell's old pub email address, crookedarm@ymail.com, and you'll have to email it as well to also put in your address and your size details. There's a few obviously the double doon thing. Remember, classic, don't back down, double doon. We got it in the intro on the Boise Bus. But of course, one more thing that I need to do, a wee bit of house cleaning as well on Bustalgia, is a wee bit of trivia. When I say a wee bit of trivia, yes. It's literally a wee bit of trivia. It's not sudden death levels. I'm not going to ask you for 22 answers here. It's only 7 answers in the end to this one, only 7. So tonight's question is, now, despite what the newspapers may have said over the years that Scott Brown was this thug on the park, and the whole time he was at Celtic, he was sent off 7 times. So that's why I know who he was sent off against. He had 1 European sending off, which kind of gives it away. Everyone remembers that one. And he had 6 domestic sendings off in the Celtic shirt. But yeah, when you read the newspapers or the reports about Brown over the years, you'd think he was some sort of player getting sent off 5 times a season. But no, in the whole time he was at Celtic, he was sent off a grand total of 7 times. So tonight, I'm just looking for who the red cards were against. That is tonight.
Remarkable numbers, that, isn't it? Only 7 times he was sent off. Because, he's got this reputation as being this no-nonsense midfielder that, opposition fans felt was like the dirtiest bastard going. And, a lot of people would have compared him to the likes of a Lee McCulloch over across the city. And he was never really like that as far as I was concerned. Yes, he knew how to tackle him. But the sort of reputation that you got from all the opposition fans over the years, you would have thought Scott Brown would have been sent off, I'd have thought probably twice as much as that.
Same.
Only 7. It's not even once a season.
No, and again, it's just the way it's all been reported over the years. You just get this idea in your head that, he must have been seen red so many times. No, he actually didn't. He had many long spells between red cards as well, but yeah, we'll be talking about how he matured in that as a player throughout the show tonight. But yeah, quite an astounding stat. Only 7 times in the 14 or 15 years that he played for Celtic. But let's now go back to the start, where it all began for Scott Brown, obviously when he signed for Celtic in the summer of 2007. Now, it's quite appropriate because last week on Bustalgia, I literally did season 2006, 2007. I've already covered the 2007-2008 season because, again, I do Bustalgia in a bit of a funny order. So it does feel like a bit of a progression by now doing a Scott Brown one because, yeah, he was the big summer signing and going into the 07-08 season. Interestingly enough, it is the first season I had my season ticket. I am the same age as Scott Brown, so I feel like I've grown up with Scott Brown and the Celtic team, from when I was 22 years old, going to Celtic Park for the first time as a season ticket holder, and he was there the entire time. So he was always the mainstay, Jonathan. He was always the guy that every team, no matter how it evolved, what manager, what players came in, he was always the constant. But when he came in, obviously in 2007, signed from Hibs, I believe to this day, is this still the record between two Scottish clubs? Because at the time it was the 4.5
I would say so.
I
don't think that's going to be in.
Yeah. Even though there was a really mysterious, remember the way Motherwell reported the David Turnbull transfer with this really oddly written piece on their website, like, oh, we've came to a great deal with Celtic, but they never really disclosed what the fee was because people were speculating, is that now the record fee? But it was so weirdly done. But I'm sure to this day, as I was writing my notes for this, I was like, I don't think there's been another one since then. I think Scott Brown is still the record between two Scottish clubs, and that was in 2007. Oh my God.
I know, it's madness going back that long when you think about it. And even at the time, I vaguely remember a lot of people were like quite gobsmacked Celtic had paid as much as that for Scott Brown. Because that was, quite a bit of money to be flashing about then. I mean, even I think now if you were to pay $4.5 million on, another SPFL player, people would be turning around and raising eyebrows rightly or wrongly, even with the fact, money and inflation's gone up. You kind of expect, perhaps the top players in Scotland to be going for around those sort of prices. But $4.5 million, I remember at the time, did send a few shockwaves around Scottish football that, Hibs were able to get such a fee out of Celtic. And it makes it all the more funny in the sense that, when John McGinn ends up almost through the doors at Celtic Park, Celtic weren't willing to go above $3 million for him. But, looking back on it, whatever it was 10 years earlier, they were quite happy to chuck $4.5 million at, a pretty raw Scott Brown, as I'm sure we're going to discuss in the opening part of the show.
Yeah, definitely was, because that Hibs team was fresh off of the Scottish League Cup that season. Hibs, I think, have only won 2 trophies in this century. 2007 League Cup and the 2016 Scottish Cup. Very memorable one, that final. But yeah, they tanked Kilmarnock 5-1 in the final. Scott Brown played in that one. But I mean, that Hibs team, obviously you had Brown, Whittaker, Thompson, I believe, left in January prior to the League Cup success. He opted to move to Rangers in the January window. They still had Stephen Fletcher, Ivan Sproul, David Murphy.
That team was a joke.
Yeah,
it was an absolute joke. If they managed to keep that full team together, Hibs could have done some serious damage. There was a top team, and they had so many of their players ended up, either moving to Celtic or Rangers around that time. It's probably, I would probably go as far as to say, I think that's the best team I've seen outside of Celtic and Rangers in terms of Scottish clubs. Was that Hibs team around that time, particularly if they'd been able to keep them together for a bit longer, because there was something special about that. There was a lot of quality footballers, but then I think there was quite a few rascals in there which maybe meant that it was time for a few of the more sensible heads to get themselves out of there, and we're quite happy to jump at it. But having said that, I would imagine if you were looking back at Scott Brown back then, he could have probably fitted that rascal character too, and I think he went on to prove that a little bit in his initial stages at Celtic as well.
He did. Funny thing was, I looked at Hibs team, I thought Gary O'Connor was still there, but he's away by this point. He'd actually left. He was at Lokomotiv Moscow in the 06-07 season. He was away there. But obviously there was a lot of stories that we were in for Kevin Thompson as well. We wanted both. Then there was stories that Rangers actually wanted Brown, we wanted Thompson. And in the end, it turned out that we got Brown and they got Thompson. So initial reaction from myself regarding that one is, Scott Brown was one of the guys where I kind of put it in the same category. I've mentioned this before when Celtic signed Mackay-Steven and Armstrong for Dundee United, where I was excited more about Mackay-Steven because he was the skiller. He was like the fancy player. And when I did Nostalgia last week, we did 06-07. A year before signing Brown, we'd actually signed Derek Riordan, who was the goal scorer. He was the exciting one. So when Brown came in, it was kind of like, Aye, all right, I guess, but you get more excited by an attacking player, a flair player. And in the end, it was similar to Armstrong and Mackay-Steven. It's like Armstrong's the one you want to be excited about. And it turned out with Brown and the whole Riordan thing. It was the same thing with them. It was like, yeah, Brown's the one you should be more excited about. And in the end, that turned out true. But, George, what was your initial reactions with the whole Brown thing? And then the rumours about we wanted Thompson chose Rangers, and then there was vice versa where Rangers wanted Brown and that. What was your feelings initially when we got Brown in?
Yeah, I was quite happy to have got Scott Brown. I think I do remember thinking, Christ, that's quite a lot of money to be paying for a Hibs player. Bear in mind, Celtic's record transfer fee at that time would have been, I think, £6 million back in those days, would have been the Sutton deal. And so, it's not a million miles away from what we paid for some of our top players under O'Neill to have been chucking that sort of money. So that did kind of raise my eyebrows a little bit at it. There was a lot of rumours as well that Scott Brown's sort of family history pointed more towards the dark side of Glasgow. I'm never sure if they were ever founded to be true or not, but there certainly was a lot of rumours going around there that he used to have a Rangers tattoo on his ankle. I think that's since been disproven, but there was a lot of things like that going around that made people think, if it's a choice between Celtic and Rangers, Scott Brown's going to choose to go to Rangers if both bids are accepted. So I remember looking at it and thinking, we're probably not going to get him, but I was keen on having him. I remember him at Hibs very well. He was a very good attacking midfield player, and he caused a lot of problems. I actually remember one of the games, it must have been in Lennon's last season, where there was proper grit, and you could tell he was able to get in Lenny's face, and Lenny found them difficult to manage in one particular game. And then I think, he scored, I think if I'm correct in saying, Phil, he scored a diving header against us, I think, the last time he played against us before he joined, which was a really good goal for anyone that hasn't seen it. It's definitely worth going back and looking at. So, I mean, in terms of what I thought we were getting from Scott Brown at the time, if you'd said to me when we bought him, he would end up becoming the sort of anchor in the midfield and becoming a Celtic legend in that way, I wouldn't have believed you. I honestly thought he was going to end up becoming like not as good, but like a Cillian Petrov, sort of more of an advanced sort of playmaker for the team, and probably chipping in with 10, 15 goals a season and a number of assists and being more on the front foot. But as it actually turned out, he actually ended up becoming the replacement for Neil Lennon over time. And it was just quite remarkable looking back at it, how that all changed from what you expected when he first signed for the club. But I mean, when he first came in, I was pretty pleased we got the deal done, because that was one I thought if Rangers had put the bid in at that time, Rangers were going to get him.
Yeah, there was the image you're talking about. It's out there on Google Images, the one of Lennon and Brown squaring up to each other. It's the last game of the season before. Now, in my head, and I think we announced we were signing Brown before that game. Obviously, the transfer hadn't been opened yet, but I had this idea that we'd already announced we were signing him, so it was quite appropriate that he would go and score a goal that day against us. But he was quite a nuisance against us, because the infamous Helicopter Sunday season, there was the game that we beat Rangers at Ibrox, and the very next game we go and get beat by Hibs at home, and I'm pretty sure Scott Brown scored one of the goals that day. Aye, he does. Aye. And I've also got an image in my head of the day that Vennegoor Hesselink scored on his debut. Scott Brown gave Hibs the lead that day. It does a bit of an arsey celebration in front of the Celtic end, because at that point he was obviously the enemy. He was an opposition player. All the fans are giving him flag, but he did pop up with an occasional goal against us. But I do remember the 05 season where the Hibs victory that kind of opened the league back up again and allowed them back into poach it in the last day from us. He did definitely score that day. And Alistair Jack's actually in the comments, he actually wanted Thompson out of the two of them. So that's interesting.
Would you have had Thompson? Because I remember it being discussed about the two of them, and I think at the time a lot of them everyone kind of seen us very similar in terms of who would go further. I think in hindsight it's a great thing that Scott Brown's had the better career out of the two of them. But at the time, I think a lot of people weren't sure who would turn out to have the better career out of them. When you were kind of looking at Celtic being linked with the two of them, Phil, did you have a strong feeling towards either of them at the time? Can you remember?
I would probably say Brown, just again on the more he's an attack minded player. At that time, he was more attack minded anyway. I mean, obviously, he regressed in terms of where he played over his career and moved back the way. But at that point, he was more of the box to box. So again, I always think attacking players are more exciting and stuff. Thompson was very much that guy that would sit in front of the back line. Ironically, what Scott Brown would eventually evolve into. But yeah, Thompson was doing that at that stage. And Thompson also was a bit of a nuisance against us for Hibs. I remember him scoring a few times against us and all. So, but I'd say probably Brown I would lean to out of the two at the time when we were all linked to them. But hey, why not be greedy? The whole story's about we wanted both of them. He's both of them, but
I could have got both of them for what, 7.5 million was it? Thompson went for 3, Brown 4.5, so 7.5 million outlay for two of the best prospects in Scottish football. I mean, it wouldn't have been bad business, would it?
I think Thompson's interview with Open Goal he did years ago, I think he talked about that Celtic definitely wanted them and there was a plan for Celtic to go in for both of them. So just one of they things, sliding doors moments. In the end, we got Brown. And when you look at the way the two careers panned out, because Thompson just became a sick note at Rangers after a while, then he went to Middlesbrough after it. I think and again, just injuries just hampered him over time. So in the end, I'd say it all worked out pretty well for us. We get Scott Brown in, but obviously now we'll go into how it started for the first couple of years, because when I mentioned I was going to be doing this show for the Bustalgia this week, we also talked about those early years and the build up to the sort of regeneration of Scott Brown, because the first few years they weren't, I've called them the lost years, not as in the footage is all lost. There was just kind of a feeling with Scott Brown where he didn't really find his feet initially. Now obviously the caveat is we know there was a lot of personal issues in the background regarding his sister and so on during that time, which by all means we understand exactly why it is. But at that time in that Celtic team, he came in as the £4.5 million signing, 22-year-old, one of the best talents in Scottish football. By all accounts, he's probably going to go on and play for the national team as well, and he did obviously do that. But of course, his first season was well remembered for, he didn't even finish the season as one of the main starting midfielders, Jonathan. It was obviously the Paul Hartley and Barry Robson tandem, which in the end was the right move because it helped us get over the line and it gave us some real fight in midfield. But after that first season, again, a lot of fans were kind of like, Brown, he was okay here and there, wee dips in form, but after Hartley and Robson showed what they can do, I think it was like, this is a midfield partnership we need, a bit of aggression in there. But after that first season, how were you feeling about Brown initially? Just like, was it okay, or were you a bit underwhelmed?
I think you were kind of looking at it and you probably expected a wee bit more from him, because if I remember correctly, Barry Robson was brought in January season.
Yep.
And that kind of gives you an indication that Strachan obviously felt he was a little bit light in the centre of the park, and that is actually probably one of the best examples I can think of January transfer business actually going on to being so pivotal in Celtic winning that league championship, because without Barry Robson, I don't think Celtic win the league in 07-08. That's how critical that move turned out to be, the Hartley-Robson dynamic, particularly in the games against Rangers. I think Scott Brown was obviously still finding his feet, and as you've touched upon, he did have a lot going on off the field that he had to try and contend with, which couldn't have been easy for him at the time to then focus on his football as well. But I think when Robson was given his opportunity, he seized it with both hands, and he made it almost impossible for him to drop between him coming in right up until the end of that 07-08 season, along with Paul Hartley. They pretty much carried us for me towards that title. And, I think even if Scott Brown had been showing what he was capable of in training and was even getting closer to, the sort of levels that we know he's capable of even at that time, I think he'd have been struggling to break up that partnership. Such was the strength of the Robson-Hartley dynamic. And I always go back to that Celtic Rangers game at Celtic Park where Vinegar Hesselink scores in the last minute. I've seen that as kind of a crucial game where I kind of looked at it and thought they're not splitting that midfield partnership up unless something major happens to one of them. One of them has to be injured or suspended. There's just no way Scott Brown's getting another look in there. But I mean, I think as well, you're looking at it, and you've got to be fair to Brown. I think, as you say, he was only 22 years old at the time. It's a big step up coming from Hibs to Celtic, as well as everything else he was contending with off the field. So I was fairly relaxed in terms of he might be one of these players that's just going to need a bit more of a bedding in period to the club. But of course, I think when you're looking at it, you do have concerns there as well that could end up being another one of these players that you sign from another Scottish club that doesn't amount to very much. We had quite a fair number of them under Strachan, in fairness. Looking back on it, there was probably more misses than hits in terms of signings from other Scottish Premiership clubs. But you always kind of felt, because Scott Brown cost so much money, Celtic would persevere with him. And thank God they did in the end.
Oh, aye, without a shadow of a doubt. Because, I mean, like Monty's even saying it here, there came a point with Bruni where I did not care if we sold him or not. He was drifting. He turned that around so much that he became the heartbeat of our team, utterly vital, a leader, a man. Because I do think after the first season, probably even the second season, those Stratton's last season ended up so flat, and it was just like, I think a lot of fans at that time would have been like, oh, if Scott Brown left, I don't think it would have been much of a difference with Tony Mowbray coming in and this air of optimism, all this great football we're going to be playing under Mowbray, as he was promising. I think, Brown could have easily been one of them. And when you look at what Mowbray did in terms of the transfers, particularly that mad January window that he has, where it was like 8 in, 7 out or something like that. It was a ridiculous window. Brown could very easily have been in amongst that shuffle, could end up at somewhere like Middlesbrough with Gordon Strachan, because Gordon Strachan just went to Borough and just signed pretty much everybody he had at Celtic, and even got a few Rangers players along the way. It wouldn't even have shocked us at that point in time. But he did obviously stick around. Obviously, 2008, he does win the league. He does get a league title, winner medal. And then in 2009, a game that we touched upon not too long ago, we did the League Cup victories over Rangers in recent years. We obviously had the 2005. Funny enough, we actually look at the history books on that one. Scott Brown got man of the match that day. He was, and if I remember when I read out the formation, it was like Gary Calder was playing centre mid. And I think Scott Brown was deployed as like a wide midfielder that day. It was like a real hodgepodge. Aye, a real hodgepodge, a Celtic team Gordon Strachan had to put together due to injuries and suspensions. But yeah, I believe he's got the man of the match officially that day. So, there's wee glimmers there. But yeah, that was his second winners medal. His second League Cup one, because obviously he's got one for Hibs as well. But then obviously the Tony Mowbray era comes in, as I was talking about there, a season I've not covered yet on Bustalgia. I will.
Oh, it's coming. It's coming, folks. It's coming. The nightmare is coming.
I've got to talk about it soon enough. Yeah, I've got Strachan's last season still to do in full, and then Mowbray's season following on from that to pretty grim seasons. But,
if you think John Barnes was bad, Phil, you have to go down that route. Tony Mowbray, Christ. Can we not just erase that from the history books? I fucking hated that season.
So bad. But here's a thing that I've noticed, and I don't know if it's like what they call the Mandela effect, but a lot of Celtic fans have got it in their mind that Neil Lennon gave Scott Brown the armband. Turns out it actually wasn't. It was Tony Mowbray who did it. Now, the night after the very famous Robbie Keane unveiling, a night that I actually went down to Celtic Park like a mug and stood there till about 1 a.m. to get a very brief glimpse of him, at the doors at Celtic Park with thousands of other fans, only for Celtic to go out the next night and get beat by Kilmarnock. Aye, cheers for that, Tory, and cheers for that, Robbie. Scott Brown actually wore the armband that night, and afterwards, when Tony Mowbray was asked about that move in a press conference, he said that Scott Brown was now the new club captain, because Stephen McManus was one of the players that went out in that revolving door in the January window. Now, I don't try to put your mind back to that time. It's just a grim time, Jonathan. I'm going to have to ask you to cast your mind back to there. And with so much activity in and out, with Stephen McManus leaving, who wasn't the best of club captains. I mean, he had a bit of success, but he wasn't really a great player, so on. But he did okay. Do you think Scott Brown was the obvious choice, or was it too hard to pin down an obvious choice at that point? Because Tony Mowbray just ripped the team up so much and changed so much things.
I mean, I think the team was obviously in a bit of turmoil back in those days, and I think he'd have been struggling to find a real leader in amongst his team. I think Scott Brown was probably fortunate in that sense that the team was probably lacking a lot of leader candidates in that sort of squad that Mowbray had. There just wasn't an awful lot of players, when I cast my mind back to it, that I think could have done the job. I mean, it wouldn't have overly surprised me if he had just decided, you know what, fuck it, till the end of the season, we'll just give it to Robbie Keane, because at least he'll command the respect of the rest of them. And I'm sure probably at the time, a lot of Celtic fans expected him maybe to just do that, because Keano was the captain, I would have thought, for Ireland back then as well. So it wouldn't have been anything overly new to him, although it would be a little bit unorthodox for a player on loan to be coming in to give the captaincy. So I think that's maybe what put Mowbray off, is the fact he knew he wasn't going to be able to keep Keane longer than those 6 months. So it's probably a case of, I'm going to need to try and pick someone here who's going to be around possibly for the long haul. Scott Brown was still young. I think even at that point, though, he'd probably demonstrated in training and in matches that he had that ability of being vocal, being present around his teammates, and encouraging them when they needed the encouragement, and grabbing them by the throat as and when they needed it. As well, I don't think he's the type of guy who'd have been shy about that, even when he was younger, going up to the experienced boys, for example, in the dressing room, which can be a bit daunting to begin with. I think Scott Brown would have been quite comfortable doing that, because he'd had a lot of the leadership traits there. even if for me at that point he wasn't really a complete player, I would have probably said, if I was looking back on it, I'd have probably had my eyebrows raised about the choice as captain. And I think, I know we'll probably go on to touch upon it in a moment, I had even my eyebrows raised even more because, spoiler alert, on one of the trivia questions, he gets sent off against Rangers at Ibrox, and he loses the head completely when he gets sent off at Ibrox. And that was a big red flag for me at that time, because I was looking at it and thinking, he's supposed to be the club captain, he's supposed to be leading by example. Not only has he got him sent off, but he's now actually acting like he would have been, like, I can understand, like, a 17, 18-year-old lad is, maybe playing in his first ever Rangers game and having a rush of blood to his head. But, Brown's been entrusted with that captaincy role, and you're expecting a lot more from him once he's given that position of power. And he just, for me, it was possibly a bit too early for him when Mowbray gave him it. But I think the fact of the matter is, because of the fact there wasn't many other candidates there, he felt like he was going to bet on the long run on Scott Brown coming good over time. And perhaps, looking back on it, Phil, it was one of the few things Tony Mowbray did actually get right in his short time at Celtic manager.
Yeah, I know, it's very few and far. Can you imagine if he just decided to give it to Diamansi Kamara or Edson Brathwaite just for the part, essentially? Could you imagine something like that? But no, history was very, very different. He obviously gave it to Scott Brown. But as you just alluded to there, the Rangers game was not too long after. So it wasn't bad enough that Scott Brown starts off club captain, first game. Robbie Keane, the big high-profile signing, for an anti-climax of getting beat by Kilmarnock just a matter of weeks later. He sort of headbutts Kyle Lafferty in the chest. And don't get me wrong, I think many of us would be quite happy to do that to Kyle Lafferty. But yeah, when a Celtic Rangers game, especially when we were struggling so badly at that point, we didn't really need that to happen. And that's, of course, the game when Maurice Edu scores a last-minute winner and they beat us at I think also maybe the games where Majid Bugera's getting a bit wild, does the whole white to the bench thing. That one into it as well.
Bugera was getting away with murder on Robbie Keane. I think he was just allowed as many as he wanted on Keane. I don't even know if he got booked that day. I think I was feeling he might not have even been yellow carded. And then he does the wink over to the touchline as if he knows he can just get away with whatever he wants. And when you cast your mind back and look at it, it's funny because obviously as fans we're getting really pissed off watching this constantly assault on Robbie Keane, and I think that's obviously contributed to Scott Brown's moment of madness, as I think he's obviously getting frustrated at the fact that anytime we were getting the ball forward and looking like we could do something, getting Robbie Keane into the game, he's getting half down. And the referee isn't taking action, and then perhaps Scott Brown's thinking, it's going to be one of these games. Naivety kicks in for Scott Brown, and he's thinking, this is one of these games where you can just get away with anything. Little does he know, he's at Ibrox. A Celtic players go to Ibrox and put their toes out of line. Very rare to get away with it, Phil.
No, exactly. Still the same to this day. Now, funny enough, though, and this again is one of these things in my head when I went back and did the research, I had this vision in my head that the infamous game that follows not long after this, that 4-0 loss to St Mirren, yes, I was sure that Scott Brown played in that game because I was like, didn't something weird happen like Scott Brown finished that game playing at right back? It wasn't him, it was Aidan McGeady finished the game that night playing right back because the subs were all over the place, everything was all over the place, and yet Aidan McGeady ends up playing at like right full back at the end of the game. It was that bad. But Scott Brown, of course, with his suspension from that game, misses the St Mirren game. But his first game back, Tony Mowbray's gone. Of course, Tony Mowbray gets sacked, and Neil Lennon was now in charge for the last 8 league games of the season. And Lennon obviously retained him as the captain running through the end of the season and would keep it going forward. And it's a good thing he did because that was him now officially the club captain. And so begins after I would say the first few years being the lost years of Scott Brown, this is where we start to see the turnaround. Russell talked about it Monday night. He talks about the regeneration of Scott Brown. There was probably 2 along the way in his timeline. And this is definitely the first one where, of all the guys to be a manager, I think Lennon was just a perfect fit for Brown, and Brown would be a perfect fit for Lennon, both playing as central midfielders, albeit Lennon was definitely a more defensive-minded central midfielder. But he turned Brown into more sort of lived vicariously through him, where he's like, well, I can't play the game anymore because I'm retired, but I can sort of mold you into a new version of me where you'll play a wee bit further back. Your job is going to be very, very simple because I've always thought that Scott Brown was never the best technically gifted player, but he did the simple things really well. And sometimes you just need a player that can do that. It's like, well, you just sit in front of the back line, you'll break up play, you'll antagonise some of the opponents, to say the least, get under their skin, and basically when you get the ball, just pass it away to somebody else and just start an attack. And that would be what we start to see with Scott Brown going forward, Jonathan, the new sort of lease of life that he had at Celtic under Lenny.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're looking at Neil Lennon and Scott Brown, the two of them just complement each other so well. I think, if ever there was a duo that was just made for each other in terms of manager and player, you'll struggle to find a better one than that. I think it's almost like what Martin O'Neill was for Neil Lennon in a lot of ways. I think Neil Lennon seen himself as that mentor for Scott Brown. I think Scott Brown looked up to Neil Lennon and thought there was an awful lot of respect, there that he had for him and all that he'd accomplished in the game. I think Neil Lennon seen what he could do with Scott Brown in terms of moulding him into more of the type of player that Lenny was himself. They both have pretty similar personalities, I would say, as well.
Yeah,
both of them have a similar sort of temperament where they are capable of going over the edge. At times, they both quite like going in for a hard tackle, although they both were very good at playing out with the ball, as well, which I think often gets overlooked for both Lennon and Brown, by the way. And I think, when you were looking at that whole dynamic, I think when it looks at Neil Lennon's looking at Scott Brown thinking, yep, I know what I can do with you. Lennon had a clear vision and Scott Brown completely bought into it. Because of that and because of the fact that they were so similar in terms of personalities as to what, drives them and motivates them and what pisses them off, I think it was just the perfect match in terms of that. And I think, if ever there was the right manager to look after Scott Brown, it was always going to be Neil Lennon. It'd been interesting because it's another one of those sort of revolving door moments because, a lot of people wouldn't have expected Neil Lennon to have got that job full time. It was a bit of a gamble giving Lenny that job at that time because he was similar to Michael Beale at Rangers now, rookie manager at the time. He'd only been in charge of, whatever it was, 11 games maybe, won all his league games and then obviously lost the Scottish Cup semi-final at the end of that season. And it could have been also different because Celtic could have been well within their rights. And, I think if they could have found somebody that ticked a few boxes, they might well have went for a different manager. And who knows how that could have played out for Scott Brown if somebody else, had came in, because by all accounts, Scott Brown under Tony Mowbray hadn't been, a roaring success, albeit granted most players hadn't, but Brown was the captain for the second half of that season and had to carry a bit of the can for that. And again, I think at that moment, Phil, if, another manager had come in, I'm not too sure Celtic fans would have been overly upset if Scott Brown had been shown the door, if it had been somebody else other than Lennon.
Aye, again, it's one of those moments and along the way with Brown where a lot of fans would just be like, if he goes, he goes. They hadn't seen the best of him yet, but I'd say the best was just about coming round the corner from Lennon's era onwards. Because one thing I'd say that he probably got very good at in this era was, and again, it goes back to what I said at the start with the trivia question, but he always had this idea that he was some sort of thug on the park, a hard man, but I think he just became very streetwise. Is a word that we use a lot in the bus when we talk about a lot of European teams that come to Celtic Park and they're very good at the old shithousery and being streetwise and they can wind you up and get away with it and all that. And I think Brown began to evolve his game in that way where he could be very, very subtle in the wee things that he did on the park and would just kind of go under the radar undetected. Avoid bookings and so forth. And I say, this idea that he was just getting sent off all the time was just absolute pie in the sky stuff. But yeah, I do think over time you saw it in the early part with Lennon where Brown was starting to become like a sort of influence on the park. We things he did off the ball, how he could drive the team forward without really being on the ball. You just felt like his influence on the park at that time. Because that Celtic team, we did the Bustalgia on the 2010-11 team. It was pure rock and roll football at times with Hooper, Stokes and Commons, the glamour players. But Brown in the engine room, that bloody rhymes. There you go. Spoken word poet. There you go. But yeah, you could just feel it with like Brown when he was out on the park. His influence was emanating around the team. And yeah, you could start to see the beginning of, right, that this is the Scott Brown we've been waiting on. It's coming, and it was so important as well that season, his first season officially, fully as captain, that it ended on a high. Okay, we didn't get the league title. We should have won it that season. It was our own stupid fault. We blew it up at Inverness, but it was so vital, Jonathan, that he got that first trophy, first of many, the Scottish Cup at the end of the season against Motherwell. Absolutely vital because that would be setting the tone going forward of what was to come for Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think he needed that moment where he was lifting silverware. Again, particularly the first one. As club captain, it makes a huge weight off the shoulders for him. And you know what? He was probably really annoyed that Celtic didn't get the league title won that season, because it's probably, in my time, watching Celtic, it's one of the most frustrating championships that we didn't win. And you're right, we only had ourselves to blame in the end for not winning it. But in terms of football, Celtic were playing far better football than Rangers that season by a country mile. And they just kind of slipped up towards the end of that season. But with Scott Brown, you were beginning to see glimpses of the player he was going to end up becoming. And I think that season is also the infamous Bruni season from memory, where the Bruni is born.
Oh, yes.
Along the way to winning that Scottish Cup tie, where he curls one in with his left foot, might well be his best goal ever scored for Celtic, and it was on his weaker foot to boot. And it's a truly iconic moment. When anyone talks about Scott Brown at Celtic, I think it's the first one that possibly comes to mind for most would be that goal against Rangers. And you've got to bear in mind that was really his first full season as club captain when that actually happened. Celtic had just rebuilt their full team after the absolute shambles they'd inherited from Tony Mowbray. And I think Lennon pretty much changed the whole team around in that summer, Phil, if you remember.
Yeah, he did.
And I think the only ones that really survived that reshuffle, I think, was Samaras and Brown. There might have been one or two others, but certainly in terms of the sort of first team players that Lennon hung his hat on, it was only Sammy and Brown that he thought were good enough from the Mowbray era to carry on and were actually going to be successful for him. And again, I think that speaks volumes as to how Neil Lennon managed that situation as well, and obviously how good he thought Scott Brown could be, because as I said, it would be very easy to rip up the whole book at that point and just go completely from scratch right from the off. But Scott Brown is somebody that was actually one of the survivors of that Tony Mowbray car wreck. And he would go on to repay Neil Lennon and some really over the next 10 years or so. But that first season, it's massive for Brown. I think winning that cup, particularly given the fact he has a massive part to play in the earlier rounds and making sure Celtic stay in that competition when they go down to 10 men at Ibrox. I think that's only going to do one thing for his confidence, and that's going to absolutely skyrocket it upwards. I think in some ways, because we didn't win the league that season as well, I think that would have pissed Scott Brown off too. The same way it would have pissed off Neil Lennon. I think if you were going to go into the Celtic changing room at the end of that season, the two most pissed off folk would be Scott Brown and Neil Lennon, that we didn't get the job done in the league title race. And I think that would have motivated them even more going into that summer to then go again, and be even stronger next season to prove that, yes, we played the better football last season, but we're wanting to make sure we have the trophies to back that up the following season. And, Scott Brown goes on to prove that time and time again from here on out.
Oh, he certainly does. And the thing is with that team, and again, it's an era that we've reminisced about many times on the bus. I know Russell's brought it up when we talk about, because football nowadays, so many players want to be very particularly coached and mollycoddled and stuff like that. But this Celtic team that Lennon was building, they were sort of the last generation of players, I think, in that early 2010s that you could go in and give them a bit of rollicking and they will respond. They won't take to Twitter and have a wee sob about, the manager was really mean to me, and or go on Instagram and post some cryptic video about, the way they're getting treated. That Celtic team was like, the banter, I'd imagine, in the dressing room was pretty good with guys like Ledley, Charlie Mulgrew, and obviously Scott Brown being the club captain. He was definitely a bit of a wind-up man. He would have fitted in quite well, and he's the type of guy that would get probably, if Lennon did go in and shouting and screaming at halftime, Brown's type of guy that would, when he sit and cower, he'd go, right, aye, you're right, we need to sort this out here. So it was such a vital cog in the machine. And just when you were talking as well about that turnaround, I can remember the one sort of blot on Neil Lennon's run as interim manager, the 8 league games he played. Obviously, there was one Scottish Cup game sandwiched in there. There was a loss to Ross County, and I remember Neil Lennon's interview after it. Even though at that time it wasn't confirmed he would be the manager full time, but even deep down, you kind of knew this is Celtic. If there's a cheap option to be had, they're probably going to go with it. But he's just saying things like, there's so many players at this club, they just don't deserve to wear the shirt. And I was convinced that guys like Samaras and that were 100% the type people he's talking about. But you're right, Samaras was one of the ones that did survive. And now when I think about it, it was such a small number that survived in that turnaround. Now when I'm sitting fighting, going, Samaras, Brown, because Forrest came into the team, but wasn't he a first team regular? He only got a couple of summer.
I think Lennon gave him his debut as well, did he not? So
Lennon
I think
gave him his debut.
He wasn't really part of the shambles that came before it, so it was almost like Neil Lennon really gave him the ball, and Forrest obviously would go on to run with it as well. But it just goes to show Neil Lennon was probably as cutthroat as it gets as a manager. And when he has those sort of outbursts where he's talking about changing the whole squads up, nobody is safe in those sort of shake-ups when Neil Lennon is involved. And it just goes to pay dividends to Scott Brown that obviously Lennon has seen enough in Scott Brown over the years. Because you've got to remember, Lennon had been there for longer than just the Mowbray side of things. I think he was actually away from the club perhaps at that time, but he was certainly a coach under Strachan, and obviously played against Brown. So I think all those things would have played in Lenny's mind, that he knew that Ross Brown was still raw at that time. There's definitely a player there. I think Scott Brown obviously felt Neil Lennon showed faith in me, so I'm now going to show faith in him. And I think that probably helped push Scott Brown on to higher levels that, he might not have been able to do so. Because I think what we find with Scott Brown is when we go through it, he's very much somebody who needs the right manager there to kind of manage him at times. Yeah. And, throughout his spell, he's had different managers. Some get the best out of him and some don't, as we'll touch upon later on. But Neil Lennon was just the perfect fit for him, and it's probably that it was the best manager to really have came in at that time from a Scott Brown perspective, and it really helped push his career on when Lennon got that job full time.
Aye, and then seeing that season in particular, the 2010-11 one, like with what went on that season off the field, with like the parcel bombs and stuff like that going to Lennon, it was. I can only imagine being in that Celtic dressing room and hearing all that happening. And Brown was such a leader out on the park as well, where it could take a bit of the sort of like pressure off of Lennon, essentially, with all the stuff he was dealing with at that point. As I said earlier on, that was the first season you really began to see his influence on the park, where it was like, the team were playing a bit turgid and stuff. Brown was the guy out on the park that was able to lead them, but he wasn't like shouting and screaming in players' face. It was more sort of like the motivational side there. It wasn't like just going on being really aggressive in all his teammates' face, telling them, sort yourself out. You could just see it was like, come on, guys, we need to do this. And you began to feel it. So, yeah, the tide was definitely turning for Scott Brown. I'd say with the Scottish Cup that season was vital, though, and it would have motivated them to go on to pick up the next season. Obviously, make sure they got the league. And of course, we did cover 2011-2012. Jonathan, you were on that show. It was quite an eventful one. Some interesting things did happen off the park as well in that season, which might have helped. And gave
you're not allowed to talk about that anymore, Phil. You're not allowed to talk about that anymore.
It never happened. Apparently.
Never happened.
Never happened. Yes, the disappointing or upsetting, whatever it is he says outside Ibrox, and big must stay open and all that stuff. So yeah, that was an eventful one. But yeah, I always found it quite funny as well that obviously the season before, when he did the Juve celebration, obviously right in El Hadj Diouf's face, and that became immortalised. Obviously, El Hadj Diouf thought he had the last laugh with the whole like the day at the end of the season with the two trophies and whatnot. But then there's like a year later, I think the way it works out, where El Hadj Diouf's playing in like the third tier of English football for Doncaster Rovers, while Scott Brown's captain in Celtic in the Champions League against like Barcelona and Juventus and stuff like that. And it's like, I think it worked out okay in the end of the way it turned out. So, Brown, I think, would have had the last laugh on that one there.
Diouf might have won that battle that season. Scott Brown absolutely won the war, let's be honest.
Oh,
There's no two ways about it. When you compare the careers, it's just a bit of a joke, really.
Definitely. Speaking of which, the corner man, I can see it. A resident Rangers fan has just turned up to the chat. So I'm sure Bob is going to have many, many nice things to say about Scott Brown all night, because we know how much they absolutely love Scott Brown on the other side of the city.
See what Bob's memory is from 2012 as well. See if he can remember anything that happened that season. That might be of interest across the city, I'm sure.
Aye, indeed. But of course, this is the time that with Lennon, and I've said this before, with Lennon being a midfielder when he was a player, one of the things I always think he had a great eye for would have been central midfielders, because that was his bread and butter. And this, of course, is the era that relates to the question that I've got in the poll. But I think this is the strongest point of like the midfield partners. He's had some good ones over the years, and we will go into more detail in the second part of the show. But this, of course, is the era when we had Brown, Ledley, Wanyama, Key, who many people forget about, and Kyle. Spoiled for choice, Jonathan, at central midfield. It was one of those ones where no matter what partnership Lennon would pick, it was basically horses for courses. Wherever we were playing, it just depended. But Brown being the captain, he was always going to be the linchpin, and it could be either another one next to him or maybe two next to him, depending on what formation it was. But there really wasn't a bad lineup there when it came to the central for midfield choices, was it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I'm just thinking about those players you just mentioned there. And, Wanyama ends up at Tottenham eventually throughout his career. Ki Sung-young, Swansea City in the Premiership at the time, a high-flying Swansea City. They won a League Cup in around that period. So, they went on to prove to be quite good. Joe Ledley, another one that would go down to the Premiership and play for Crystal Palace. Biram Kayal, Brighton and Hove Albion. So these players all moved to the English Premiership, which a lot of people think is the best league in world football. And granted, okay, maybe they didn't all play at the top end of that league. But I always find that quite interesting, the fact that all those players were able to make that move down. But one of the biggest detractors, and one that I always find quite funny, is a lot of people think Scott Brown wouldn't have been able to hack it in that league. You only have to look at the fact that he's partnered up with all of these midfielders. And so he must be doing something right, because he's always been a constant at Celtic. And for me, he could have quite easily walked into any of those clubs that I've just mentioned there that the others ended up moving on to later on in their career. I think Scott Brown must have absolutely loved playing in that team under Lennon, because I think when you look at it, not just because he was the captain, he was the best midfielder out of a lot of them, because by that point he was beginning to develop a lot more. He was now a settled player. Neil Lennon was getting the best out of him. And it was really a combination of who was going to be playing with Brown in that position, because, he could have quite easily looked at that. When you're looking at those options, putting in like a Wanyama and a Ki Sung-young or a Wanyama and a Ledley, and taking Brown out would have been an appealing option. And I'm sure to some fans back then, they may have thought, you know what, we should be doing that. They're better than Scott Brown. And that goes to show just how strong that midfield lineup was. I mean, we could actually have afforded one or two injuries there. It wouldn't really have hurt us at all, well, particularly domestically. Anyway, it actually almost reminds me of the sort of strength and depth that Postecoglou has now in some of his areas, particularly out wide, I would say, was how strong we were in the middle of the park back then. And I just think it's testament, Phil, to the fact that, all those other players that you've mentioned were all great players in their own rights, all went down to the Premiership to earn their stripes. For you, I mean, with Scott Brown, was he ever somebody you ever seen playing, down in the Premiership at some point? Could you have, witnessed him playing for like a Spurs like Wanyama did? Was it something that I can't really remember them ever being heavy links, but I'm sure there probably was.
That's how I was asking when you mentioned that there about moving to the Premier League with all the other players. I've in my head, I've got this faint inkling that there was like a couple of like passing rumours, like Everton and stuff like that, but it was never like real pursuit of him. Maybe just one of these lazy bits of journalism, but it never ever seemed to materialise. And of course, our pals across the site will say us because he was never good enough and all that. But no, I mean, the guy played in the Champions League with us and did pretty well there. Held his own against some very, very good midfielders in the middle of the park. So, I mean, he was absolutely fine. The level that he played at Celtic, he achieved a lot. I don't think he needed to go to any other league to try and prove his legendary status and so forth. He's a player when it comes to, because I've seen him playing in England. By this point, no, I did feel it was good. I don't know. At that time, I wouldn't have thought it was going to be 2021 before he left, another 10 years out of him. But at that stage, with the way things were going, I was like, we're going to see Brown at Celtic for a good 5 or so years till he's sort of like hitting 30 and so on, because at this point he's in still sort of like mid-20s, like 25, 26 years old. So at that point you're like, oh, they're going to get a good few years out of him here. And then by that point, would he have been able to go to England in his late phase? Probably, again, with all sell-on things that English teams think about, where they're always like, they're always thinking of the next move. I don't think a 30-something-year-old Scott Brown would be too appealing for them. If they were going to strike at any point, it would have had to have been in the mid-20s, and it never ever materialised. But I say, at the end of the day, his career worked out pretty well, and he's obviously got that legendary status. I think he could have hacked it, though, when you're asking that one. Could he have done it? I think he could have definitely done it. I think there's no problem there. I think he could have fitted in with quite a lot of teams. You talk about Joe Ledley going to Crystal Palace and stuff like that. Berham Kyle ended up at Brighton, who I think were Championship at that point, but he's definitely still at Brighton by the time they move up to the Premier League. Brown could definitely have hacked it there. I mean, a team like a Man United, a Man City, Liverpool, no, that probably not. But yeah, he definitely could have done a job for, like I say, an Everton or something like that. Could have been like a decent level for him. So obviously, from our point of view, it didn't happen.
He helped complement the fact that those players ended up getting those moves. I think Scott Brown had a big part in the fact that, the likes of your Joe Ledleys, your Ki Sung Youngs, your Wanyamas. Even I know Wanyama was probably a better defensive and technical player than the rest of them, and was probably going to move on to bigger things. But I think Scott Brown probably helped bring him up to that level quicker than he would have got there without Scott Brown. I think Scott Brown is one of those types of players that even when he was in his mid-20s, I think he was probably able, even at that point, to get an extra 5% out of the players he was playing alongside, just because of how he went about his business. The fact he was one of those motivational players, but maybe not so much in the same way as Lenny. I don't see Scott Brown as somebody who would necessarily always be shouting and screaming at people. I think Brownie would be better at, potentially actually just geeing people up and just getting their adrenaline pumping a lot more. I think he'd also be the, similar to Lennon in a lot of ways as well. I think he'd also be the first one to put an arm around somebody's shoulder if he thought, they were struggling, to adapt to playing in the league or whatever. And I think he always had that strong sense of loyalty towards any player at Celtic, no matter how long they'd been at the club for. So I think, I think he would definitely have helped bring those midfielders on, and was part of the reason they ended up getting their moves down south. I think that's just another string to his bow. I think a lot of players would have enjoyed immensely playing with him, because when you look at, the players that these guys would go on to play with, down south, Scott Brown was just as good, if not better, than a lot of them.
Oh, without a shadow of doubt. Just before we head into the break, obviously you mentioned there, like you were talking about like players and injuries and so forth. At that time, if we had an injury, it wouldn't have really made a difference. We could swap around. And Alistair Jacks brought up one, and this is a synonymous moment with that era of that Celtic team. But Kaya would have been a Celtic legend. Well, that's obviously alluding to the Lee McCulloch tackle, because Kaya was on course to, be a really big deal at Celtic. I think he could have been with us for a good few years, and or maybe even if he didn't get that injury, when he came to the whole transfer away, we probably could have got a bigger fee, or he would have went to a bigger club at the time than Brighton, who, as they were in the Championship. But that was, that's one of those nights as well where like he's went out to do him on purpose. And I can't remember in the game, did Scott Brown do a wee sort of like subtle get him back during the game, or did it?
Yeah, I think he did.
Aye. Because then when you're on the park, you see that happen to one of your teammates. It's like, I'll get you for that one. But that one was one of the most sinister sort of like challenges, and the fact that he never got a red card for it as well, just ridiculous.
Oh, it was a horror tackle, and I think that's another thing about Scott Brown, is he was always the first one over to defend his teammates if he felt they were on the receiving end of poor challenges, or if any player wanted to try and start on one of Scott Brown's Celtic teammates, they were going to have to go through Scott Brown first. He didn't give a fuck whether it was V. Jamesy Forrest that was getting antagonised, or whether it was like a Virgil van Dijk who could probably handle himself. Scott Brown is still going to be straight in there amongst it, making sure he's there to stand up for his teammates. And it's probably quite an interesting one, because I think a lot of people make comments now about the current team to say we need more players that will actually do that side of it.
Yeah,
because
that's true.
So many players that are technically really gifted, but probably aren't going to be getting involved in that side of the game. And unfortunately, Scottish football is kind of like that at times. It can be a bit of a battleground, depending on who you're playing and how the game is playing out. So I think guys like Scott Brown prove invaluable in moments like that, and making sure you protect your assets. Like, for example, like a Scott Brown, last season when we were playing against Rangers in that cup semi-final. You know, if Scott Brown was in his prime in a game like that, Lundstrom doesn't get to dominate that game the way that he does, even if he's getting away with the tackles that Billy Madden's just assigned to give him a free pass on. Scott Brown would end up getting him back, and Scott Brown would end up being able to put him back in a box and get Celtic back playing football. And I think that is something that we do miss now. We don't have him, although I do think Callum McGregor is developing into that sort of role, as we'll touch upon in the second half of the show.
Aye, we will indeed. We will, because we'll be starting off with a topic pretty much along those lines, talking about being the antagonist, which is obviously a word that's got negative connotations, but it can have positive connotations as well, because he was definitely viewed as an antagonist. Wasn't an antagonist to us, but other opposition fans definitely saw him as an opposition players. But we'll be talking about some of his best wind-up moments and all those wee things that he did to get under players' skin, some of our favourite and funniest moments as well, because he's had a few good wind-ups along the way. So that's us hit an hour already, Jonathan. And Steve was meant to be joining us, but he's definitely running late now. Oh, he's gonna get fined for missing the show. That's it. Fine for him coming.
That's it.
But yeah, I'll put in the musical interlude, and when we come back in a few minutes, we'll dive into the second half of the show, and we'll be talking about his antagonistic ways to opposition opponents, so particularly our pals across the city. So we'll see you in a couple of minutes.
I mean, you've all that stuff at the start. They won't be playing Tina Turner on the coach on the way home, will they?
Some of his comments about me deliberately trying to cause controversy. Well, I work in the media now, and you've got someone sitting there next to you who's an embarrassment to the media profession. He's an apologist. He's a charlatan. He's a Rangers puppet. He's a cheerleader. That's what he is.
And yes, we are back. I've been looking forward to this segment in particular, because this is some of the comments already that came up was ones that I even forgot about, and I was like, "Oh God, yes, we'll definitely be talking about that over the next segment, the antagonist." Because yes, somewhere along the line in this sort of era of Scott Brown, after he's became the Celtic captain and we're starting to get a bit of traction, bit of success, he became that guy, the guy that every other opposition fan seems to just hate. Every time Celtic roll up to a game, if he's on the ball, it's all the boo. He gets booed louder than anybody else. He's the guy that opposition midfielders, we go in with a bit of a harder tackle on him and so forth. He was a guy that, if he did get a hard challenge, there'd obviously be a wee ironic cheer around the stadium. That'll be one we'll be talking about as well. What's the goalie doing, Tom? People forget about that one. So yeah, he was that guy, the antagonist. But the thing was, the more it happened, the more he seemed to relish in it. He was a guy that thrived on it. And this is a weird fact as well, Jonathan, when it comes to particularly Rangers' attitude towards him. I think he, more than anybody, Scott Brown, has been a guy where when Rangers have signed a player, you didn't see them over the years saying, oh, this guy will sort out Dembele, or this guy was signed will sort out Scott Sinclair, this guy's going to sort out Edward, or whatever. Every single central midfielder Rangers signed, their fans would be like, oh, he's the guy that's going to sort out Scott Brown. It was Scott Brown. And they're just like rent-free in the head. I remember it being a tag that they attached to Dorrans, to Ryan Jack, to Scott Arfield. These are the type of guys you never see them signing somebody and going, oh yeah, we're bringing him in to shut down James Forrest or somebody. It was always Scott Brown. And I think, Jonathan, that speaks volumes of what how rent-free he is in the head of them.
Oh, absolutely. I think when it comes to Scott Brown, I think the antics eventually of Scott Brown caught up with the Rangers fans, and it was all about trying to get one over Scott Brown. They almost wanted to get one over on Scott Brown more than they wanted to beat us. At times it was getting that ridiculous with how much they were obsessed over him. Obviously the immediate one that pops to mind is the what's the goalie doing where the tackle comes in and Brown gets bumped to the ground, but he's already played the ball through and Dembele dinks it over the keeper. Beautiful moment. But it's just he's had so many times where he's really rattled him. It's been never really since the Brunei against Juve. I think it all starts from there with the Rangers fans, and then I think just every time he just leaves a little bit on the midfielders, they just really got their noses up. I think the reason they didn't like it as much, Phil, when I look back on it, is Rangers are always kind of renowned for me for having the players that put the boot in. Yeah, that's kind of what they're known for. I always think, and maybe I'm a bit biased, but I always think Celtic are known for playing the sexier football, if you like, and having more of the technicians in their team, whereas Rangers prefer a bit more no nonsense. We'll just put the boot in a bit of blood and thunder. And they didn't like it because Scott Brown could mix it up, and he could play some nice football, but he also knew how to go about the other side of the game. And if somebody tried to put their foot in on Scott Brown, Scott Brown wasn't shy on putting his foot back in on them if the occasion merited it. And I think the older Scott Brown gets, you see the switch happen, Phil. He actually goes from a position that used to, for example, that Rangers game we were talking about in the first half of the show, where he loses the head at Kyle Lavery. Yeah. He gets to a point where Rangers players are putting bad tackles in on him, and he's getting up and he's laughing at them. He's actually laughing in their faces because he knows he's actually rattled them, and he knows they're doing that to try and get a rise out of him. And when he laughs in their face, it actually flips the whole situation and gets the player that's made the tackle even more wound up. And there's another one that comes to mind, and that's Alfredo Morelos, because Scott Brown had him on fucking strings at times. Honestly, there's a few opportunities over the years where he just knew how to push Alfredo's wee buttons and get him to just do something silly and get sent off. And Scott Brown would just laugh at him the whole time as if, I can't believe how easy you are making this for me. But I mean, he's had a few of those sort of moments, hasn't he, over the years, where he's just good at getting under players' skins. And I think the older he got, the better he became at that side of the game.
Oh, the Morelos thing. There's one game against Rangers in particular where it was just endless that day. Where it was we beat them 2-1. Lennon had just taken over as interim manager. After Rodgers left, and it was like I think a win put us 13 points clear, and that would be pretty much home and dry. And we beat them quite late on with a James Forrest goal, but Morelos got sent off quite early in that game where he elbowed Scott Brown because Brown had just been nibbling away at him all day. And there's an image where, again, I don't know if my mind's playing tricks with me. I know Brown's definitely laughing at him. There's an image of him going off and Brown standing there having a drink of water while talking to Lennon at the sideline. But in my head, I was like, did he wave at him, sarcastically wave at him as he went off, or am I thinking a different incident? But
I think he did. I think he did.
He's definitely laughing at him as he's drinking his water, just as Morelos is walking by with the typical sour puss and petted lip. But then at the end of the game, I know that's the one when Andy Halliday absolutely explodes. And there's the hilarious image, you can find it on Google Images, where Halliday's trying to get to Brown. Well, Christopher Ayer, Scott Bain, and Scott Brown are all standing, kind of all holding him at arm's length, and they're all just busting out laughing right in his face. But he's raging. He's so angry. And that's also the game when he goes over to the Rangers fans at the end and does that in front of them. Oh, man, that game was just... he was just toying with them all day. And of course, that's the one where they go about, oh, Ryan Kent punched him, and that became a thing where we're celebrating titles and we're celebrating like victories, and you are putting things like a picture on t-shirts of like Ryan Kent taking a swipe at Scott Brown, and it's like serious levels to this game. Come on, man, he is really rent free in you guys' head.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I remember the Ryan Kent punch because even the Rangers fans in my work, they would kind of quite often go and like they'd pull that picture and like put it into the group chats and stuff like that. So, but you do know you lost that game and you've lost the league title by losing that game as well. I mean, Scott Brown got up and laughed about this rubbish, weak-ass punch that Ryan Kent's tried to throw and somehow got away without getting sent off for it, which was one of the most baffling decisions I've ever seen in my life. He properly tries to hook him, but that's another story for another day. But Scott Brown he just knew how to get up and get on with it, and you know you can tell Scott Brown's obviously said something to him on the way past. He was very good at stuff like that. I remember another one, Rodgers' first season. Remember when we I think it might have been after, I can't remember which one it was it the fifth? I can't remember exactly what goal it was, but he ends up running into Joey Barton. Maybe it was the first. And everyone else is making a beeline for Dembele. I think it's maybe the first or the second one. And, you know, everyone's making the beeline. Scott Brown, you just see coming in at the end of the picture, and he pretty much just goes up and bends over at Joey Barton, makes sure he gets his 2 cents worth in before running off to celebrate with the rest of the team, because Barton had been bad-mouthing him in the build-up to the game. And Scott Brown was having absolutely none of it. And it's actually quite funny. If you ever did go back and watch that game, you'll spot it. All the players run to the corner with Dembele, but Scott Brown goes charging into the middle because Joey Barton's on his arse from memory. Dembele's put him on his arse, and then Scott Brown gets his little dig in before running off to celebrate with the rest of the team, and then iconically says, you know, after the game that, no trouble at all. He's quite easy men against boys, really. So he knows when to pick his moments. I think by that time as well, he kind of got a handle on how to manage the media too, and he had everyone on strings for a long period. There was a reason, I think, Phil, people used to say Scott Brown ran Scottish football when it came to the playing side, both Celtic fans and opposition fans. When, you know, everyone had their own different opinions on it, of course, as to why he ran Scottish football. But it was one thing that, you know, ironically, a lot of people were in agreement of, despite supporting different clubs at the time.
Aye, that's true. And that's also the game you're talking about is also the one where Barton couldn't even look him in the eye when they were shaking hands at the start. After all the trash talking and the build up to it. And of course, there is a famous image out there after Stuart Armstrong scores the 5th. It's like one of those Celtic unique angle type cameras. It's like very low down in the net, looking up at Joey Barton, just really his head bowed down. He's about to pick the ball up out the net after Armstrong had made it like 5-0. And it's just like, it just summed up because obviously he leaves shortly after that one. But that was a quick and easy victory, that one. One of the other one-sided battles against one of their, I'm going to call them a Scott Brown problem solver. One of these guys they've always got in the middle of the park that's going to sort out Scott Brown. Hilariously, remember when Ian Black got that tag for them? They were in the lower division. They threw them in a cup game. And then going into the game, there was a lot of talk about the clash between Scott Brown and Ian Black. There's going to be a moment during the game, a flashpoint. But Scott Brown just managed the game perfectly. We beat them 2-0, dead comfortable game. That's when Griffiths and Coleman score. But right in the 89th minute, I talked to him about being streetwise and how he manages games at this point in his career. He just leaves one on Ian Black. And that's where we get the hilarious, what became a meme, where he's just kind of like, one of the Rangers players is basically giving him a bit of lip and he just kind of points at the scoreboard like that. And just, you know, he's just like, what? Aye, that's that one, the famous Ian Black moment. But I just the whole game.
What year was that? Was that about 2014 then?
That'll be 2015. It was Ronny Deila. We drew them when they were in the 3rd tier in the semi-final. First meeting since 2012, and brushed them aside. But yeah, he waited till the 89th minute, Jonathan, and then he just thought, now I'm going to get you. Now I'm going to leave one on you. And it was just beautiful. The whole
I think that's probably
the scoreboard was amazing.
I think that must have been the game where he's probably got street savvy. That's probably a game you could probably pinpoint at the moment Scott Brown realised he had Rangers' number. You know, and fair enough, people will turn around and say Rangers were a bit of a mess at that time when they were still in the lower leagues. But I think Scott Brown knew how to play the fixture by then and not get sucked in to all the other rubbish that sometimes goes around games against Rangers Football Club. And I think that's probably the first signs of him beginning to realise I can actually have a bit of fun with this. If I play my cards right, don't let myself get wound up by these tackles and actually flip the whole situation. It's actually brilliant psychology the more I think about it, from Scott Brown, in the sense that he just knew him reacting in a positive manner to them trying to wind him up just got them even more fucking worked up. And trying to try even harder to nail him the next time, and then inevitably they'd pick up the cards and Scott Brown would still be the one that's left laughing. So it became a trademark for him, I think, probably from that moment on with Ian Black right through almost all the rest of the games he played against Rangers.
Oh, that was definitely the beginning of it. But again, it wasn't just Rangers that we had. He had some interesting battles with. Obviously, when we would play Aberdeen during the sort of Deila years, and that when Rangers went around, obviously there was a few players in there that thought they could be a bit of a wind-up merchant. Obviously, Shea Logan, thinking he was a bit of a hard man at times. But actually, it was a few years later though. I believe it's Sam Cosgrove, Aberdeen player, was in with a hard tackle. And then another Aberdeen player follows up by booting the ball off of Scott Brown while he's down, but he just gets up and he does the sort of Conor McGregor swagger thing. Oh, it's just
the
brilliant.
Scott Brown strut. The Scott Brown strut, that's what I'm going to call it. The Scott Brown strut. He just gets up and he kind of gets on with it, and he's just laughing. And again, that's another example of like a younger Scott Brown reacts there and probably gets himself into trouble and picks up a needless booking, or even worse, gets himself sent off because he can't handle the situation. Whereas now he's just like, I've just rattled them completely and I'm totally in their head. I'm just going to walk off and march this off and make it like, is that the best you've got, lads? Still standing. Yeah. And, I think Cosgrove as well around that time might well have had previous, I can't remember if that was before or after the Scottish Cup final, where remember he bust Tierney's mouth.
Oh, that's Jayden Stockley. Jayden Stockley. He did look at Cosgrove though,
had a few hammer throws in that Aberdeen team around then, particularly up front. But Scott Brown, it was another example of when whoever it was that was playing against Scott Brown, even when they did have the physical stature over him and were probably able to throw him about, Scott Brown didn't really care that much, and he never really got himself overly wound up, and it certainly never made him shy away from making a tackle. I think players often tried to intimidate Scott Brown, and that's a perfect example of it. Pittodrie, I think, and if the tackle doesn't do it, we'll put the ball into him and we'll really try and rattle him that way. And he just gets up and gets on with it. In a way that just most players just wouldn't, Phil, if they're in that situation. You're within your rights to jump up and be a bit pissed off at something like that. Most players would react in a more aggressive manner when something like that happens. I'd be fucking raging if it was me, and I've just been on the receiving end of a bad tackle and someone's booted the ball off me. I'd be like fucking wanting to get up and go and grab somebody by the throat. But Scott Brown is matured so much by then. He just knows he's got everybody playing out the palm of his hand, and he doesn't need to get involved in these situations because his presence almost by then makes people want to go after him. He was almost like a bullseye on his back, and people were just wanting to take him out, and he understood that was what people were trying to do, and he decided the best way to try and work that in his favour was to react by laughing at them, because then they would end up doing something even more stupid the next time they came to blows, and it worked brilliantly for him.
Just put it right back on them, and it just winds them up even more, and they'd be more prone to do something stupid. Now, a quick announcement, everybody. Joining us right now, better late than never, it's Steve-O.
He's made it.
Welcome, Steve-O. We're still getting fined 2 weeks
production van in the back. Man, the production van, to play my music.
Welcome aboard, Steve-O. Welcome aboard.
No, listen, as I said, I do apologise. I was going to originally join into the start, but life unwound and stuff gets in the way with kids and affairs. But do you know what? It's better late than never to join in on a bit of Scott Brown. So listen in the background, there you go. So
you've jumped in at a good point. We're talking about all the funny moments of Scott Brown winding up opposition players and managers and so forth. And funny enough, Jonathan, you talked there about that Aberdeen Cup final, the Jayden Stockley red card. Do you remember though Scott Brown did antagonise Derek McInnes at the end, him and Michael Lustig? They made it very clear. They actually ran into the Aberdeen technical area and celebrated right in front of him, and Derek McInnes had a wee whinge about it afterwards. It's like, hey, we've just won the Invincible quadruple-treble. Come on, man. But yeah, I think Scott Brown and Lustig, they knew what they were doing with that one.
There's a lot of dig, I think, between Brown, Lustig, and Aberdeen, particularly with the whole thing with Shea Logan. And again, I think that's another example of Scott Brown's loyalty to his teammates. You've got to remember, because the whole thing with Shea Logan, if you remember the backstory, was behind that was a guy that played for us called Alexander Tonev that was accused of racially abusing Shea Logan, but I don't know.
Terrible player.
Oh, terrible player. And in some ways, it may have been right just have just left him to go under the bus on something like that, because he was never really going to get a game for us. But Scott Brown stood up for him in that situation because there wasn't sufficient evidence to actually show that he had, racially abused Logan. And I don't think it was ever proven sufficiently with enough evidence. I think he did get a ban. But I don't think there was really enough evidence to back that up. But I just went to show again that Scott Brown was very loyal to his teammates, because Alexander Tonev, I'm pretty sure, was only on loan at the time. And as Steve was just said, he was dog meat. He was dog meat, but Scott Brown still had his back.
Was that fine? Did that not carry on into when he left us as well? Like, was it not a fairly sizable suspension?
No, it was all when he was playing with us, because I remember him being on the bench, and I think it was when we played Inverness at the end of the season, that Scottish Cup semi-final. I'm sure Tonev was on the bench. He was back in and around the first team, not the starting 11, but he was getting back onto the bench and stuff near the end of the season. But by that stage, he was pretty much going to be staying long term after that. Another one that just came to my mind there, and it's more just because it was a whole sequence of events. There was a game we played against Hearts. I think it's Lennon's third season. It'll be the second season to Tenants, the big Tenants across the front of it. And I'm pretty sure Hearts score a goal that gets disallowed. It crosses the line clearly. I guess Zaliukas scores it. And this is one for the days of VAR and Hawkeye, and Celtic literally break up the park. And in about a 30-second passage of play, Celtic go and score. And it was Scott Brown that was at the end of it. And as you can imagine, the Tynecastle natives took it very, very well, guys, because, of course, Bruni being Bruni at that point, the celebration's established, runs up behind the goal and just gives it the arms out right in front of all the lovely Hearts fans. Yes, they were very pleased with that one. Just as I'm going through my head, just trying to remember all of these different moments when he just...
it was an exuberant Bruni that time. I think there was a lot more gusto in it than it normally would be, but he knew how to wind up the Hearts fans. He'd seen them off a few times by then, and I think he quite enjoyed trips to Tynecastle. That was probably up there as one of his favourite trips as a Celtic player, because he knew he was going to get pelters from them, and he loved it. I think Scott Brown was one of those players that absolutely loved playing in those environments where he was in where everyone hated on him and nobody wanted to see him doing well. So I think that just made him have that extra gear where he was like, you know what, fuck you, I'm gonna put in my best performance of the season here, and I'm gonna try and get on the score sheet, which will wind you up even more.
I get injured at the end of post-match pish. Sorry, a Thursday night forum. So I've been on the treatment table, not able to get in the squad. So a 45-minute run out when a game's of processions is allowed.
Well, Steve, you've just joined us, so we're just talking about any great wind-up moments that Scott Brown had. Any that come to mind? Do you think we've not covered yet? Any that stand out as really memorable in your mind, where he just got right under their skin and just a wry smile on his face?
I like the ones that aren't even wind-ups. The staring, the Bartons, just this firm stare as they're walking past. Yeah. I prefer those moments. I know we can all laugh and joke at the, getting dusting yourself off and getting up and giving it all the swaggers and the celebrations and that. But I like those wee sort of cerebral moments. I like those wee sort of mind games, or and then the sharp comments like when we're talking about title races, we weren't. They were. Yeah. I like those. I like those wee quick turns. I like those wee sharp ones over the more sort of jocular ones. I think they've a wee bit more in it for me, because that they're really thought those ones we're talking about are spontaneous and they're emotional. But I like the wide ones. I like the ones that he's thought about and he's like, so the other ones that ring for me.
Aye.
And then, you know, the whole, what was he saying to you? I was asking him how he was getting on that, all that kind of stuff.
Aye, some of the post-match interviews he did were just great. And again, as his wee off-the-cuff comments and the wee wry smile when he does it, it's like, we know what you're doing. I just thought, I remember one where another horrible one for that lot. We'd had a game against Rangers in the 2010-11 season. We beat them 3-0. It was a season we didn't win the league, but it was one when Hooper basically retires Davy Weir in that game and sends him for a hot dog. But there was an instant in that game where Kyle Bartley stuck a bad one on Scott Brown early in the game, and it kind of became a running thing between they two in the fixture before. I can remember the last official Old Firm game in 2012 when liquidation was looming. They were one with the big banner with the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and obviously in the tunnel, as Steve said, those were the cold stare and stuff like that. You know, the Celtic team's already lined up in the tunnel, and Bruni's at the front just looking dead ahead, not paying attention to anybody. And the Rangers team the way the camera's positioned by Sky, you can see the Rangers team are coming for their away dressing room. And Bartley kind of stops and leans over and says something in Bruni's ear. He's got like a daft smile on his face, trying to wind him up. And Bruni, and to use a wrestling term, Steve, he no-sells it. Completely no-sells it. He's just like, this doesn't even acknowledge him at all. It's like, I'll do my talking out on the pitch. And we certainly did the talking the way that season ended. But that one stands in mind. I love the wee things. Yeah, just don't even acknowledge them. Don't even, pay them any attention, because that'll wind them up even more. Where they're like, I'm going to get a reaction at him here. And then they don't get a reaction. And they're like, shit, what do I do now? I never got the reaction I wanted. Oh, fuck.
I think he's always got that sort of intensity to him, Scott Brown. He's always had that side to his game. I think it's a fine line, because he can be a bit of a jovial figure quite a lot as well. But, you know, he's got that very serious side to him as well, that, you know, when Scott Brown goes into sort of game mode, you're not going to be able to impact on him at all. You know, you're not getting in his head. You know, he is the master of mind games. He's not somebody who's going to let somebody else dictate what happens in his head. You know, once he matured, you know, he was very much in control, and he was never going to be letting anybody else, make any decisions for him. And I think, you know, he had that side of him where he could just be fully focused in the tunnel. And then when he would go out onto the pitch, you know, he'd be able to just go about and do his business. And then, you know, he would let his football do the talking. And then after the games, that's when he would hit them with the sharp darts. You can tell sometimes when he was doing it, he'd been preparing these for weeks, because sometimes the papers, particularly when it was build up to Rangers games, quite often became whoever Scott Brown was up against, they were trying to turn it into a battle between the two of them. And Scott Brown just wasn't having any of it. He would let his talking happen on the pitch, and then he would get his cheeky remarks in
afterwards, as it should be done. Take notes, Michael Beale.
As you covered there, John, as you're saying, and obviously you guys have spoke about earlier prior to me joining in, it's strange to see that transition in what Scott Brown became, because he went from being a lad, a wide boy, you know, a lot of mouth, sort of interspersed with a fair amount of action, to being ice cold.
Oh yeah,
and calculated. The transition was so notable in how he acted, how he played, full shooting match. And just as we're at the stage that we're starting to get to, he still showed his sort of laddie side at times, and saying what these things that do in the parts, but he turned into this ice cold, calculated, well-oiled machine. Who says nobody was putting him off, nobody was changing what was. He set out his agenda, he set out his stall, he knew what was going to happen in his head, and he played it in the field. And I'll be honest, because I'm coming in, when we signed him, I never have thought that's where I went.
No, definitely not.
No, I don't think anyone would have. It was a total turnaround from what I think we thought we were buying to what we ended up with. I think was complete chalk and cheese situation. It's not, I think, what Gordon Strachan would have envisaged when he brought him in, compared to what he turned out to become, under Rodgers and then Lennon again. It's just a totally different player from what we thought we'd sign. But it was definitely the right move, changing him about, and he developed into it so well, didn't he?
Yeah, if he shit haircuts to shaved heads,
Aye, that's it. The war baldy, you know, wherever he had hair, you're like, nah, that's not the Scott Brown we know and love. He's got to get the hair shaved. We're going to war here. Come on, Scott.
That's why I was so annoyed. See, if the FA Cup, I was really wanting them to get through in the FA Cup when they played Burnley. Because I was thinking, if they get like City, I bet he goes and shaves the head, gets the suit on, head shaved for like the FA Cup semi-final at Wembley or whatever. But it wasn't to be. But I still think you might do that as a manager. You know, if Fleetwood were to end up in like a crunch game, they got to like a playoff final or something ridiculous, I think Brown would end up shaving the head. He'd go back to type
definitely.
for something like that.
You know, managers suit up for cup finals. Scott Brown shaves his head for cup finals. That's what he would do.
I do that in life. I believe in that. I always make a joke and say, when life gets too hard for Steve-O with hair, shaved head Steve-O comes out. Fuck it all.
You Scott Brown get the same mentality then. Well, funny enough, you mentioned there about like, you know, what you would have thought. We wouldn't have seen him turning into that player. And we talked earlier on about him being written off, and there was a few times along the way. But as we learned with Scott Brown, he's like a cat with 9 lives. You know, he's never ever a write off. And we talked about the regeneration under Lennon, but obviously the other one that comes to mind is after the 2 years under Ronny Deila. Scott Brown, and it's fair to say most of the Celtic team were kind of in the doldrums. They were a bit lost, they were a bit worn down after Ronny's regime, essentially. You know, Ronny came in with a lot of good ideas and so forth. There are many players that didn't buy into it. There are some fans out there that are like quite angry at a lot of the players for the cliques and so forth and that. But Scott Brown, again, especially after that loss to Rangers in the 2016 Scottish Cup semi-final, he missed a penalty that day. He just didn't look up to the races at all, as most of the team didn't. By the end of that season, even though we won the league, which was expected we'd do, again, many fans were like, see if Scott Brown left, see if James Forrest left, basically all the players that were all culprits that day, see if they left, I wouldn't care. But of course, what happened that summer, Brendan Rodgers came in as the manager. Sorry, Brown Warrior, I'm going to have to talk about Brendan Rodgers. I know you don't like him, but I'm going to have to talk about him here. But in comes Brendan Rodgers, massive excitement around the fans. But of course, despite the fact he was high profile, he did still have that weird stigma around him where he was a bit of a David Brent character, essentially. There was a lot of things from his time in England, managing Liverpool. And I'll never, ever forget when I read a headline on whatever website it was a Daily Record of one. So, it read, and when I read it, I just heard it in Brendan Rodgers' voice, and it was Scotty B can be my Stevie G, and I just went, that's pure David Brent. I mean, if Brendan Rodgers definitely said that is pure David Brent. Because even though I was excited for Rodgers, I've still had that sort of, he does do some cringy things at times where I remember watching the Liverpool documentary they did on Channel 5 where he had the thing with the envelopes, and he had the players, I've got a name and an envelope here of who I think's going to let me down and all that this season. He was using motivational tactics. I was just like, but when I read Scotty B can be my Stevie G, I was just
man.
Oh, the David Brentisms have started. Here we go. But it's safe to say that Scott Brown found a new lease of life, Jonathan, in that Brendan Rodgers team. It was remarkable. And don't get me wrong, Scott Brown wasn't the only one. That Ronny Deila team pretty much carried over, and Brendan Rodgers sprinkled a wee bit of magic dust on it. We added a few of his own players like Dembele, Sinclair, even Kolo Touré coming in. But yeah, a few players, and particularly Brown, found a new lease of life.
Yeah, I think it was one of those ones where you were kind of looking at a Celtic squad that at the time everyone thought was at the end of its cycle under Ronny Deila, and it was going to be a case of like quite a big reshuffle when Rodgers came in. And again, it was one of those question mark moments of, is Scott Brown going to be able to manage the reshuffle? Is he still going to be a part of the playing squad when Brendan Rodgers has a look? Because I think it wouldn't have been that long before that Brown was pictured, was it, on the pavement outside one of the chippies, not looking in the best of conditions. The papers managed to catch him in.
Either just after or just before the League Cup final, we beat Dundee United under Ronny Deila. It was around about that time, either just before it or just after it. But it was then, and when it was all about fitness with Deila, sitting eating a kebab or whatever it was he was eating on the pavement. Oops.
Yeah, so I mean, there was a lot of people wondering if that's going to be the end for Scott Brown. He's going to be able to bring himself back. But by that time he's approaching 30, if he isn't already 30 years old. And I think a lot of people were beginning to wonder if time was against Scott Brown. And you've got to remember, Brendan Rodgers was one of these guys who, again, was quite big on having his players fit.
he wasn't going to be having any players, in his team. Like, for example, Chris Commons wouldn't have survived, I don't think, under Brendan Rodgers.
Yeah.
To be perfectly blunt, I think Commons wouldn't have had the work ethic that Brendan Rodgers would have expected of his players, even if he'd been a bit younger. So I think, Scott Brown, it was kind of, adapt or GTS was going to be the options there. But I think there was a telling moment, I think, before Rodgers even took the job. I think he went to London and he spoke with Scott Brown, or maybe just after he'd taken the job, he made the point of speaking to Scott Brown first. And I think that must have given Brown a lot of confidence. I think Rodgers has obviously said that he was reassuring him he's still going to be a part of it. He still felt there was more to come from Scott Brown. I think when somebody like Brendan Rodgers, given what he had accomplished in the Premiership up to that point, gives you that sort of boost and your confidence to say, look, I know things haven't been going as well as you'd have liked over the last couple of years, and you've probably let yourself down a little bit. I still think there's a player here, and I think Scott Brown is another one of those guys who, when managers show that faith, and similar to what Lennon did in his first spell when he came in after Mowbray's disaster, I think Scott Brown loved that fact that he got a bit of loyalty and a bit of faith from Brendan Rodgers. And I think when managers showed that sort of faith in Scott Brown, he then wants to repay them tenfold, and that's exactly what he went on to do, wasn't it, Steve-O?
I mean, I've heard this story before, and I believe Scott Brown approached Brendan Rodgers, and obviously he says, you're coming in, this and that. And Brendan Rodgers says to him, listen, as long as I'm here, you're here.
Oh, yes.
And Danny McGrain's here.
Did it also happen in the Clyde Tunnel where Scott Brown walked up to his car and Brendan Rodgers went, oh, here we go.
Fucking hell.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Walter Mitty shit. Yeah. No, listen, I think everything you've said is true there. It's kind of funny, isn't it, how we always talk about these sliding doors moments. If Bruni sitting buckled over with the kebab, eating these Hollands, moment in the paper, looking as if, and let's be honest, there's probably multiple times, hasn't there been, even we'll go beyond Rodgers, where you've thought Brown's down and out, or at least on paper he was fading. But no, listen, I think it's interesting because he was reassured by Rodgers. I think Rodgers is not daft enough. He sees a player and he knows there's something in there, and he also looks at where he is in his career, what he's done, what age he is, and he knew that, he whether you like him or hate him, I think he knew how to make a guy feel 10 foot tall, and certainly with Brown, it would be easy for him to disregard him, put him aside as being the old guard, a failed captain, time to move on and do all that kind of stuff. But no, having a conversation, whatever happened, however it panned out, sometimes guys like Brown maybe do need that wee bit of reassurance, because you think about it, we went through that kind of the Ronny Deila. It was what it was, and it was an experimental stage, and it was, there was a turnover of players that were coming in that were substandard, yada yada yada, and it could have been quite easy for him to just draw a line under that and say that was time for him to move on. But whatever Rodgers said to him, it obviously done thing, and I think the most important thing was he bought in, and it was a second example of him showing that he can evolve and that he can change and that he can adapt. Because look at, as we say, when he came in at first, bit of nutter, sort of rode that wave, converted his style, then he went through all that Mowbray nonsense. So he's always evolved, and he's always changed, and he's always found his purpose, made himself useful, and then taking it to the next level. So no, listen, that first season, even under Rodgers, we saw a rejuvenated Scott Brown, and then he came back, he also looked leaner, he looked fitter, he looked more muscular. He totally bought into it. So no, it was again another change in him.
It's an interesting one as well, Steve, with the fact he wasn't able to buy in with Deila and what Ronny Deila was trying to do, because I think a lot of fans, looking back on it now especially, think what Ronny Deila was trying to implement was probably along the right lines. And I think it goes back to prove that I think with Scott Brown, I think he is somebody that needs the right person around him. I don't think he could relate to Ronny Deila in any way. I think Lennon, as we touched upon in the first half of the show, Lenny was somebody that was very similar to Scott Brown in personality and indeed on the pitch. They had a lot of similarities as well. So I think he found it easy to get on with Lenny. I think with Brendan Rodgers, he commanded respect because of what he'd done in the Premiership. I think you're looking at somebody like Ronny Deila because he was a bit more of an unknown manager, and then he's trying to implement different strategies that are completely new to the whole Celtic squad. Scott Brown's almost like, nah, I'm not going to bother adapting to that because I didn't see the point in it. But I mean, would you think there's something else Ronny Deila could have done to have got the best out of Scott Brown? Was that a missed opportunity over those couple of years to have, got Scott Brown invested in what Deila was trying to do? Because again, that could have played out quite differently.
Yeah, possibly. I think it was a combination of factors. I've said time and time again on the podcast that I think, in principle, when you look at the ideas and the philosophies, I hate that term, but when you look at the ideas, thinking long term, in a kind of roundabout way, Deila was the kind of prototype Ange Postecoglou, the rookie version of him. But he was coming in and he wanted long-term progression. He wanted, I mean, we never saw it, as I said before when we discussed him, Phil. But in his head, he had an idea, a style of play, and what was going to drive them. It was all meant to be this fitness. And again, I don't want to go into it, but it turned out his fitness was total counterproductive to high-intensity sport. But whatever, he had all these ideas, right? And it was just the right idea with the wrong execution. And I totally prescribe to what you're saying, Jono, about did he not, he commanded respect and this and that. And I think that is what it is. That team with Lenny was the last vestiges of the lad culture. It still had those kind of guys that were, kind of old school, and that were, we're fucking in charge, who the fuck's this guy, and all that kind of stuff. So I think there was an element of that. There was an element of this guy was trying to radicalise things, but he had very limited to no sort of history, success. He had no pedigree behind him. So it was kind of hard probably for these guys to cash in. And then I also think maybe John Collins was wrong guy, right ideas. And Bruni, I'm not sure, Bruni would have known for his Hibs sort of allies and stuff and that.
He won the League Cup under John Collins in 2000.
Exactly. He didn't get on well with him, I don't think either.
He's worked with him. He was one of those guys that didn't like him. He was still with that sort of close connections with guys once he'd left. There's a lot, it's one of those things. If your mates really dislike somebody and it's a continual thing, it just rolls on. Yeah. So the respect's already severed there with John Collins. So I think that's another secondary thing. It's like, listen, this guy's a fucking head case. And, that can shield you off. Rodgers, as you say, is a different story. Commands respect. Whether you think he's been a rip roaring success or not, he's been there, he's done it, and he's been at a high level. So it would have been remiss and foolish of Brown to not buy into it. And I think probably under no uncertain terms, Rodgers has basically went to be either with me or either without me.
Yeah.
And Brown's a smart guy. He'd have looked at Rodgers, looked at his profile and thought, right, I kind of want to be getting in with this guy. And even now when he's at Fleetwood, done an interview and he says, I talked to Rodgers, I talked to Strachan, I talked to Lennon. So he obviously done something right and got his confidence, didn't he? But I don't think there's anything to come back, John. I don't think there's anything really that Deila probably could have done. I think it was just a set of circumstances that were unworkable for what I've said, and John Collins maybe being the wee straw that snaps the camel's back.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you there. But looking at it, Phil, from that sort of angle with Scott Brown, I mean, going back to the original point with the fact, it hadn't really worked out under Deila for him. He seemed to be kind of struggling a little bit more for form. He was kind of, looking like he was, one of many, in fairness, that were at the end of his Celtic career. I remember James Forrest being another one that I thought was absolutely finished around that time. And, here he is still playing for us now. Was Scott Brown somebody that you've seen as being a key cog in Rodgers' wheel, when he first came in, or did you see him as being somebody that Rodgers would dispense of?
I certainly didn't see Scotty B being Stevie G anyway, as for certain after that headline. But no, I was in that camp of many Celtic fans after that defeat to Rangers, how low it felt and how that season sort of petered out, and it was like we were so angry with so many of the players, and it was like every one of them. I know with Rodgers coming in, you were expecting like a massive overhaul again. And I say it's so surprising when you look at the amount of players that just carried over for that team that found a new lease of life. Incredible. So it makes you think that how much were they really phoning it in under Deila? How much had he lost that dressing room? You think about how the talent that was there, and they showed it with the right guy in charge. But at the time, I was in the camp of, hey, if Scott Brown goes, he's been a good servant to us. We've got a good 5 or 6 years out of him now. So be it. If longer than 5 or 6 years at that point, be coming up on his testimonial at that stage, actually. That's how long he'd been around. But yeah, you're genuinely like, well, we've got a good run out of him. Maybe it is time to go. But again, he just found it like a cat with 9 lives. He just found another level, another gear. And under Brendan Rodgers, this kicked off an astounding run of success for him. As up to that point, trophies, we've been winning trophies consistently, but what was about to come was incredible. But before we get to obviously finishing on talking about all the unrivaled success, he had the question I put in the poll, and obviously there's a wee thing we're going to talk about. Because Scott Brown, he's played for Celtic at this point from 2007. He's played with a lot of different midfielders along the way. Here's a list of just some of the names that have partnered up with him. Some are great, some are good, some are a bit in the middle, but just to give you a wide spectrum essentially of who's played alongside him in the middle: Massimo Donati, Paul Hartley, Barry Robson, Mark Crossas, Landry Nguemo, Ki Sung Young, Joe Ledley, Victor Wanyama, Berham Kyle, Nir Beaton, Stefan Johansson, Stuart Armstrong, and Callum McGregor, to name just a few. But the question is, guys, who in your mind is the best partner alongside Brown? Who did he bring the best out of, and vice versa, brought the best out of him, do you feel, through that who's who of centre midfielders?
I'd say Joe Ledley. I always think Joe Ledley and Brown were probably, I think just in that period, for me, I always felt Ledley and Brown complement each other. Ledley being a left footer as well, I always felt added a little bit more to it, but it's very difficult. I mean, I think they're all very good options. I always remember Lenny's first spell in that sort of first couple of seasons in particular as being really rock and roll football, and the way that they went about their business at that time was really impressive. And I always felt at the heart of that was Ledley and Brown. So for me, I would probably say that they complement each other the best. I think there's a few that run really close behind on that side of things, like Callum McGregor. Towards the end, I think Brown and McGregor struck up a really good partnership, and I think you see what Scott Brown brought to the table for Callum McGregor. Even now, I think Callum McGregor has adopted a lot of what Scott Brown was doing at Celtic, and he's actually probably improved on his side of the game of actually spotting where balls are going to be. His positionings became a lot better from working, closely alongside Scott Brown in that holding midfield role. He's not afraid of making a cynical tackle now, Callum McGregor. I remember earlier this season at Motherwell when we were only 2-1 up. He yanks the shirt to make sure we get a 2-1 win and takes the red card because he's the last man. Very much something that Scott Brown would have watched with a wry smile on his face when he's seen the highlights of that, because he'd have done the exact same thing in that situation. So I think, if you're looking at it, I'd probably have Ledley as my favourite. I think Callum McGregor, though, certainly has been the biggest one that's been influenced, if you like, by Scott Brown for me. Steve Hodge, is there anyone that you kind of look at and think that was a real special partnership Scott Brown had over the years? Because I think they're all quite similar. I think you make a case for almost any of these guys.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be boring, and I kind of hate myself for it, and I'm going to have to say Callum McGregor, because I think his early years, and I think the partnership's there, and I think the teething problems that he had, where he kind of neither really had an identity, and he was kind of settling, he was in the team, he was out the team, and then, when I look through those sort of, Mowbray, Deila, that kind of stuff, to me, it just kind of blends into one. Did we ever really see the best out? And probably not. And even some of the Lennon spells, I think he had a great relationship with Ledley.
Yeah.
Was the relationship with Wanyama particularly good? Well, no, but it was what it was. It just, it happened. Nothing particularly memorable there. But I think in terms of when did we actually really start to see the best of Scott Brown, the best he's played, the discipline, the passes, the positional awareness, and there was more of a focus on him where you would look and you would be interested in what he was doing. Well, this is maybe a person for me. Like, he was always just another guy who was on the park. He would maybe roar into tackles and cheer them on, but I noticed far more in his sort of later years. I paid more attention to what he was doing, and it was always with Cal McGregor. I think it allowed Cal McGregor to develop as a player, as we've said, and it's kind of ironic because McGregor's now become what Brown was.
Yeah,
Brown was staying deep and doing all the dirty work to let McGregor be more creative and score more goals, which was great at the time, but it allowed us to see all the passes. But now that's what McGregor's doing, and you probably argued this is the best version of Cal McGregor we've seen. Just in that position where he's the pivot for defence, pick the ball, ping it, and make it happen. It's just effortless. So for me, that's the best combination. You know, and we could a couple of years down the line and say, what was the best combination that we had with Cal McGregor? And you'll have that point. Go, well, when he played with Scott Brown, he was this, that, and that, which was Brown. These early years when some of his other partnerships. But for me, the best version is where he is now, and what Cal McGregor is now. So it's kind of weird how that cycle's going to come up. And when Cal McGregor inevitably gets to this stage, talking about him, probably that's going to be my answer there as well. So it's fascinating, but now I have to be boring and say Cal McGregor, because that's when I really saw every aspect of his game honed over all those years and perfected the best version of him.
Oh, it's not being boring at all. And it's interesting that the two have picked players who are left-sided, because again, it's that old right side and a left side complement each other. Talking about centre-back partnerships, ideally having a left-sided centre-back and a right-sided one, centre midfielders left and right, because I would have leaned to either Callum McGregor or Joe Ledley out of the options as well, but there is so many good players there, and Brown's the one consistent throughout it all. So yeah, I'd probably lean over for them. And also when it comes to Joe Ledley, well, one thing I always think about him his time at Celtic is he was a guy that went very under the radar at times in games, because when Joe Ledley signed for us in 2010, it's around about the time that Facebook was starting to explode as the next big thing in like social media, and everyone was into, you know, liking pages that had some really daft names. I remember liking a Celtic page that was called was it Unappreciated Joe Ledley What Great Society? That was the name of it, and it was true. Joe Ledley was that guy on the park that he was doing a lot of work, but you didn't notice it because he just went about it. And again, it was him and Brown worked together. It's just a perfect tandem, but they complemented each other really well. I say part of that could also be the whole one's left-footed and one's right-footed, just gave you that perfect balance. But yeah, Joe Ledley's is a good shout there. But as I said earlier on, Steve, you heard that when we were talking about the Neil Lennon era, at one point in time you had Brown, Ledley, Key, Kyle and Wanyama as his 5 centre midfield options at that time, and it's like, well, Neil Lennon, you know, if fans nowadays want to pick holes in Lennon for this, that, and the next thing, one thing he definitely was good at was picking a centre midfielder, probably because he played central midfield.
Exactly.
Because at that point in time, Jesus, the options, it was an embarrassment of riches. But yeah, in terms of like the best midfielder, that's probably I'd lean to. It was I'll do an in between what you guys say. One you say Carl McGregor, one says Ledley. I'll be the bit of both, really, essentially.
You're going to go for Victor Wanyama just to keep it a
Victor
draw.
Wanyama, just
to make it fun.
I put the poll up, obviously. I'll check that at the very, very end of the show and see what the viewers have said, because I put on the options. I had Ledley, Callum McGregor, Wanyama, and then I originally put 4 options on it. So I couldn't fit all of the players on that extensive list there. But of course, let's now finish off and talk about the ridiculous amount of silverware, the unrivaled success that Scott Brown's had as a Celtic player, and particularly in his time as the captain. Because obviously when he first joined in 2007, he picked up his first trophy, was obviously the league title, the 07-08 season. He added the League Cup a season later, but after a couple of a bit of a dark time under Tony Mowbray where nothing came that way, obviously that first Scottish Cup, we talked about earlier on, the first trophy as captain. In the end, after I don't know if it's 14 or 15 years that he played for Celtic, but he played over 600 games. I believe it's 620 it came out at in the end. 620, I wrote it in my notes. I've got 620 games. He's won 10 Scottish League titles, 6 Scottish Cups and 6 League Cups. He was a captain for 20 out of the 22 trophies that he won at Celtic, and he is literally the face of the 9 in a row and the face of the quadruple-treble, because incredibly, he's not injured for any of those trophy days. He's always there lifting the trophy. It's not like he was suspended or anything for any of the cup finals he played in. A ridiculous thing, because every picture you see of Celtic lifting a trophy in that era, always Scott Brown the one that's lifting the trophy. So he literally becomes the face, and the incredible run started under Brendan Rodgers with the invincible treble, then became the double treble, and the treble and the quadruple-treble is an astounding run. I say unrivaled success, Jonathan. It puts him up there in the upper echelons of Celtic players, the immortals, essentially. We talked about the James Forrest episode that we did. We're going, is he a great? Is he a legend? And somebody in the chat kind of bailed us out and said, well, when it comes to the Lisbon Lions, they're immortal. And you're like, well, there's a level above legend, immortals. With a CV like that, is Scott Brown an immortal? He's definitely a legend anyway. He's definitely in that one, captain, leader, legend after all. But what a CV. Silverware.
I think if you're looking at the trophies and his resume in terms of how much success he's brought to the football club, then he's right up there with any player that's ever played for Celtic. When you're looking at trophies won, I mean, he's certainly going to be the guy of the 2010s. Pretty much the last 10, 15 years is synonymous. If you think of Celtic, you think of Scott Brown. The two of them go hand in hand just because of how much success he's had. And bringing this all about, as you rightly say, he's been there through pretty much every single one of these trophy lists. He's not really missed a beat in terms of that. I think particularly nowadays, you don't see as many players hanging around football clubs, and not just at Celtic, just in general, really, as they used to do. Testimonials, I remember, used to be a bit more commonplace, perhaps, in the 90s and into the early 90s, but they don't really come around as often, I don't feel, anymore. I think players tend to move around a lot sooner, and Scott Brown was certainly one of those players that, as we've touched upon, was certainly good enough if he'd fancied trying something different to have got to move somewhere else. But the fact that he chose to stick with Celtic and that longevity of success makes him, certainly a legend. I think he's certainly close to being in the bracket of the Lions. I think it's hard to put anybody in that bracket just given what they've accomplished. But, I think if you're looking at the next tier down, like, for example, like a Henrik Larsson, I think Scott Brown is certainly in amongst that sort of category for his own reasons. And most of that is down to the amount of silverware he's collected over his time and the influence he's had on his club, because it's going to be legendary. It's going to be things people will talk about for years and years to come, the success Celtic had. And Scott Brown is a massive part of that history. I mean, Steve-O, when you're looking at it, if you're looking at the sort of ladders of where you could put Scott Brown into all these different categories, where does he fit? Does he fit like into Martin O'Neill's team, which I always kind of think most of them were kind of legendary figures? There was a lot of them in there getting to a European final. Would he slot in there? Would he go even a branch above that? Would he go a branch below?
I think for me, it's undoubted to say, great, legend. Those can just roll off the tongue, whatever one you prefer. They're all the same. Right. It's kind of good that someone had said, as you brought up the whole immortal thing, and I said this previously before, and I'll reiterate it as well. We have to hold in high regard what the Lisbon Lions team done. Undoubtedly. Unmatched, unrivaled, whatever way you want to put it. They are on a different plateau, different level entirely. But see, if you ask the question, you just say, greatest ever Celtic team. And it could be of any team.
Yeah.
I don't buy into just going, Lisbon Lions, that's it. That's the greatest ever. Every possession, they were the best, because they weren't, right? They weren't the greatest collective team.
Yep.
They're not all the greatest collective players in their respective positions. You need to split the two of them apart. Yeah. And if you're going to put together maybe an all-time Celtic great, then he's going to at least make that squad, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So if you want to say, what do you base it on? Do you base it on longevity? That could be years, it could be number of games, it could be goals, it could be trophies, it could be whatever. It ticks all those boxes. Maybe not reached a European, team final, he's maybe not had, but everything's relevant to what you're playing around. And unfortunately for him, we've never been in that position where the team's pushed on. That's not his fault. That's not his fault. You can be a great, great player surrounded with shit. I'm not that he ever was, to be honest, but my point is, how many great, great players, legendary players, have played for shit countries or shit teams, and they've what they've done has been diminished because they've never been able to reach that level, which is impossible because of circumstance. He's very much that. And people try to diminish some of his trophies because of the wrongdoings of idiotic, businessmen at the other side of the town. That's not to do with Scott Brown.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think for me, he's absolute nailed on legend, and you can mix him in with anybody you want. Martin Neal's team, dare I say it, Lisbon Lions, the maestro. Go any further, go as far back as you want. You can mix them in that conversation, and you shouldn't be embarrassed to say that, because you've seen a guy give his heart and his soul to a club, develop, stay relevant through different managers, and ultimately be, as you said, the face of unprecedented success. Whether you rate how it was done and what was around it, it's irrelevant. Because when you open up those pages, you see those pictures, it doesn't have star, Hibs were shite that season, Rangers were crap. It doesn't say that. So for me, he's absolutely top bracket. And I think we need to start laying a bit more respect on some of these modern long-term players that we've got, and not diminish them because of bleary-eyedness about Lisbon Lions or previous, sides. Treat them on their merits, and that's it. So for me, straight up there, no qualms about saying that, and I think he will be fondly remembered.
Aye, he'll get the chance to get the celebration he deserves at the Citadel and the Hydro. It's either the Armadillo or the Hydro. It's over at the SECC complex anyway. Obviously, he's got his night coming up with Mcginlay'S, because sadly for Scott Brown, it didn't end how I think he deserved it to end. But that's another story for another time on Bustalgia. One day I will have to cover that season.
Even worse than the Mowbray one.
Yeah, I know. I've front-loaded Bustalgia when I've been doing all the seasons. I've done all the good ones, and then I'm like, I've got a few really depressing ones to go. But I'll find a way to get around. I'm thinking of doing a sort of, I'll call it the COVID trilogy, where it's like the beginning, the middle, and then coming out the other end, Ange Postecoglou saving it. So that'll be like the middle part of it. I'll need to do that at some point, because I haven't covered the season that got curtailed by the coronavirus, and then the obviously the 10 in a row season, yes, and then obviously Ange Postecoglou's first season. So I can put that together as a trilogy, like do them 3 in a row, and that'll be the middle one. That'll be the Empire Strikes Back one, where the bad guys win, unfortunately, and then of course we then go on to get back to this where we deserve. But yeah, it wasn't exactly the ending that he did, but see, I'll cover that in another episode. But overall, yeah, without a shadow of doubt, and Steve said, regardless of the circumstances around it, we can only beat what's put in front of us. It's not our fault that Rangers did what happened to them happened in 2012. That's just the way it is. That's their problem, not ours.
And the thing as well as that, see, we speak about players. You can't compare apples and oranges.
Yeah.
So see by what I've said, and I've said he's in there with these, this and that, right? I'm not saying he's the same as Jinky Johnson. I'm not saying he's the same as Larson.
Yeah.
He's a different player. He's a different position. What I'm saying is, we have greats, we have legends all over the park.
Yeah.
One isn't necessarily better than the other.
Yeah. I get it.
They all have their place. And I think he fits into the conversation of the collective of these people.
I get you.
So I think that's something that you need to clear up, and you can make which appears to be a sweeping statement, because we as fans get a wee bit precious when you throw out names and you can't compare it with him. Talking about a team,
Yeah,
There are many positions in that team.
Yeah, of course. It's just it's all about opinions at the end of the day, and without a shadow of a doubt, Scott Brown for me definitely in that legend category, and yeah, he'll be celebrated forevermore from generation to generation. He'll be a name that people will talk about, and just for his wind-up antics alone, I think it's worth always bringing up his stories. Those will be ones that get passed down as well. Oh, the great Scott Brown, what he used to do to terrorise them. But yeah, that kind of. I know, Monty, you've been asking in the chat, come on, Phil, announce a 3-hour show. Unfortunately, that's me got to the end of my notes, so we've kind of ran out of Scott Brown material. So I'm afraid Bustalgia is usually about a 2-hour show. If you're lucky, it might go to 3 hours. Depends just how ruckus it is that night.
And do you know what? Because sorry to jump in, see, just throw something in because we always like a wee rib in there every now and then.
Aye.
Put it into context. The other side just put Tav in to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, come on, exactly. Think about that. That sums it up. That sums it up perfectly. When you look at it again, comparing it side by side, again, you look at things over the years where people talk about who's a better player out of Messi and Maradona, and it's like, well, they're two unbelievable players, but they all play in different generations. So you've got to take all these things factors as well. But for this current generation of football, Scott Brown is very much in the legends category. This current era of Celtic, the 2000s era, it's definitely in that category.
That's what's great about football. It's opinions. It's like Pele or Maradona. You'll have your favourite.
Exactly. You will. Now, do you want a bit of trivia to end the show, guys? Do I go?
Yes.
Obviously, I put at the start, Steve, I don't know if you caught the question, but basically, we're concentrating on Scott Brown's misdemeanors with his red cards, because contrary to belief, Steve, you might have got the same vibe as me, where over the years, the way it's reported, you'd think Scott Brown was a hatchetman, and he would get sent off all the time. He's actually been sent off 7 times in his Celtic career, and that's not too bad a ratio given how long he was at Celtic. Yeah. But you would think he would have got sent off about 20 times the way he gets spoken about. But basically, the question was this: can you name the 7 teams he was sent off against? One is a European game, the other are 6 domestic games. One of them we've definitely spoke about tonight.
Yeah, well, we can take Rangers out since they were
they're the easy one, aren't they?
We'll hit Rangers early. We'll hit Barcelona as well.
The Neymar. I didn't mention Neymar the night. Wow, imagine that. Just like him out.
Yeah, I mean he was quite ridiculous that evening. From memory, it wasn't really much for kick out from Brownie. Should have kicked him a bit harder, at least made him feel it if he's going to get sent off.
Exactly, make it off.
I've also got Kilmarnock. He got sent off against Kilmarnock.
Yes.
The season that got curtailed, he was sent off.
Was it that one? No, it was one where it was one of the last games Brendan Rodgers was in charge, and it's the Scotland won the league at Rugby Park.
Yep, so he jumped into the crowd and he was sent off for it.
Well, you say he jumped into the crowd. More the crowd came to him, Steve-O, if you watch it back.
I know.
And then the crowd kind of all just jump into him. It's really not his fault he gets sent off in that game. Pesky Celtic fans get him sent off.
I know. But yeah, I still come on. When Scott Brown won the league at Rugby Park, it's that game with a fluorescent yellow and black shirt on.
The ugliest goal I think he must have scored as well. It was so ugly.
Shocking.
I'll do though. I'll do.
Yeah, well,
right. Let's think here. I hate getting on the hoof. This is terrible. Has he been sent off against Hearts? I've got to play the optics.
Amazingly, he has not. You would think he would have. For all the antagonising he did against the Jambos, amazingly, no, he's not been sent off for Celtic against Hearts.
I thought Aberdeen, because I feel he's had a few run-ins with Shea Logan.
Yeah, Aberdeen, the game when Virgil van Dijk scores a last-minute winner for us, a wee cushion volley at the back post, then gives it all that to the Aberdeen fans. Scott Brown gets sent off about 10 minutes ago. I think Niall McGinn takes quite a shocking dive, and it cops him a second booking, and he gets sent off, got his marching orders that day, so he has been sent off at Pittodrie.
Yeah. Motherwell?
Yeah, Motherwell's one of them. He was in the 2010-11 season. Before we went to Ibrox to play them when Samaras had his double that day, Samaras Sunday, Brown was suspended for that game. He gets sent off against Motherwell a few games before, copped a second booking in a game, gets sent off late in the day. So that's why he misses. If you remember the shocking lineup Celtic fielded that day, Ibrox and still won. Scott Brown's missing for the team because he was suspended. That's why.
Oh. It's actually quite surprising when you're even looking at this, because even these games, I think he only got a straight red card. What against Rangers and Barcelona? The other ones are all second bookings thus far that we've named. So he's not even like somebody who's...
There's one more where he's got a straight red, and I can understand why you've probably erased it for your mind.
Ooh.
Why you've forgotten about it.
Is it league or is it cup?
It's a league game.
Cup game, isn't it? Oh, it's a league game.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was going to suggest Hibs, but I feel like Hibs would have been too friendly for him.
No, he was never sent off against
If you
Hibs.
go, how recent was it in his time?
Very recent, like last season at Celtic, and that's probably why you've forgotten about it.
COVID, that's why.
He was set off against Ross County, but that's not the one I'm thinking about. The Ross County one was in Brendan's first season. I believe it's the same game when Eric Sviatchenko tackles a guy, doesn't tackle, you're 2 yards away from him, and the boy takes a horrendous dive, and the referee gave them a penalty, and they got a 2-2 draw. Scott Brown gets sent off in that game as well. But yeah, the Ross County. So the final one is from the Terry Monroe season. The one that we all try to forget.
I can't remember who was in the league that season. Did that season actually exist?
Did it actually happen? Was it a fever dream? I wish to God it was.
I think.
I mean, it could literally have been any of them. We were that fucking garbage that season.
Well, there was a lot of points there. So there was a lot of low points. Oh God, who was in that league? I'm trying to think.
A team that we notoriously struggle against up until recently.
Livingston. Is it Livingston?
It's Livingston.
Livingston. Came off the bench and got sent off after a matter of minutes. So that's the game as well where Lennon's pulling a really daft face in the post-match interview just as they come to him.
Is that the weird sort of...
Yeah, like fixing his snuss or something like that. But yeah, it was that was a terrible day, that one.
I think for that.
I think it was drew 2-2, and I remember it snowed as well in that game, and it was just like, it was one of the sort of final straws for Lennon. I think Lennon got sacked like a few weeks after that if he played Ross County and get beat. But yeah, he came off the bench and got sent off that night. But yeah, so the teams are Livingston, Aberdeen, Rangers, Killie, Ross County, Motherwell, and his European sending off with Barcelona. But overall, for a guy that was deemed a pure hatchetman and a thug, that's not too bad. 7 red cards.
Not bad.
Not bad.
It's only what two straight red cards out of the 7 as well.
Aye.
So just 2 bookings.
He's
done all right there, hasn't he?
And you know, it's funny you say that because you're placing a bet and you player to get booked. It's a certain game I've put Scott Brown in there, but no, apparently not. More the fool me.
No, I say there's a lot of players that have got a lot of worse disciplinary record than him, but he was always portrayed as some mad hothead. Actually wasn't that bad at all, the numbers show. You use stats to prove anything, there you go, and that proves it. Now, as for the poll that I put up at the start, I asked the viewers who their favourite midfield partner of Scott Brown's was, and with 50% of the vote, Callum McGregor has won. Victor Wanyama was second, Joe Ledley was third, so it was 50% to 31% to 14%, and then Ura, the very mysterious Ura, was 4%. That's people voting for Near Beaton, naturally, or Landry and Guemo, no doubt about it. Mark Trossas.
You're getting Guemo top one, Jono. Guemo top.
It's got Brown on the back of it, Steve. You wouldn't have seen it earlier, but it's got Brown on the back, a bit of a battered top, just like Scott Brown. He's been through the wars this stop, but still survived. Still survived. It's still in the wardrobe, so dug it out for tonight, especially.
A good choice. But yeah, that's us. We've wrapped up this show. That's another Bustalgia in the books now. So yeah, we'll be heading off. So as I said with the TNF last night, obviously Celtic aren't playing this week. I know there's a charity game, but we're not doing PMP for a charity game. We're just not. We're not doing anything for the Scotland game.
Is the charity game not?
Did you see the fake lineup?
In it?
No, that's a fake lineup, isn't it? Or is that?
No, he isn't part of the squad though. But did you see the fake lineup and it's got like
Angura
on the bench and shit like that, and people are going, "I can't believe he's."
I know the Celtic lineup they posted on Twitter. Brilliant. Chris Commons was the player that they used as the one standing next to the lineup, and it was just like Commons, Caldwell, was on the bench, Barictor, the Celtic Legends team for tomorrow. But somebody in a group chat I'm in posted it, and it's like, mate, you've pure been done up like a kipper there, mate. And he's like, oh, so I have.
Get a up front with Brack back.
Aye. Oh man.
dear.
See if that was the lineup, if that was legit, I would actually be up for doing a PMP for that, just for the banter alone, just for that. I know we need to talk about this. We need to
It's going chatted here right back.
Fucking had Barikta playing left wing, we'd actually finally get to see how fucking good a player he was. I don't think we've fucking got to see much of him.
The best bit is it's got Itaguchi on the bench and everybody bought it.
Amazing. So good. Guys got a broken ankle in Japan. Unreal. But yeah, it was doing the rounds. Yeah, it was fantastic. But as I say, if that was the real team, I would actually be like, you know what, let's watch that. Just out of morbid curiosity, I've got to watch this. But sadly, it's not the lineup. But yeah, Celtic are playing obviously a Legends game over the weekend. As Scotland are playing, but we won't do PMP for that. But the bus will be back on Sunday. We're doing Sunday Blair. David Logue will be in the driving seat there. Myself, Mark, Regan will be on that. And Russell's planning to do a Sunday sesh, permitting that everything's settled with the big move and all that goes according to plan. And he's hoped to be back on Sunday night. If all else fails, then the Brothers Boyce will hopefully be back on a Monday. We hope to see.
We should be. We're moving furniture tomorrow, so we'll be behaving this weekend. So we should be fine for Monday, I think.
I've lost track of what days of the week are now with that. Like,
I've seen people in the chat come in and saying that they basically their whole week, their calendar depends on the Boise bus, and they're so confused by the shows being out of sync and stuff. But it's now become part of the sort of the ethos of the bus. You know, it's just
part of the reason why we called it the bus, because the bus timetables always change. Phil, that's kind of part of the reason behind the name.
They do. Never on time. Never can be relied on. But no, we're heading out now. We've had another fun episode. So, guys, enjoyed yourself tonight. Steve-O, for the short time you were on, enjoyed yourself, mate?
Yes, mate. Better late than never. Plenty of laughs and stuff to chat, yes. And probably I missed out some of that more sketchy periods.
Yeah, that's true. You came in at the right time. You came in bang on.
For all that good stuff, Steve-O.
all that good stuff.
And Jonathan, enjoyed yourself tonight?
Yes, very much so, Phil. Looking forward to you questioning me even more on Scott Brown on Monday. I've learned a lot tonight, so I'll keep all of that in the memory bank just in case you throw a curveball on Monday night.
Yes, you just never know. I'll keep you guessing up until then. But yeah, folks, we are heading out here. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, whatever you get up to, and we will see you on Sunday. Catch you later, guys.
I mean, you've all that stuff at the start. You know, they won't be playing Tina Turner on the coach on the way home, will they?
Some of his comments about me deliberately trying to cause controversy. Well, I work in the media now. And you've got someone sitting there next to you who's an embarrassment to the media profession. He's an apologist. He's a charlatan. He's a Rangers puppet. He's a cheerleader. That's what he is.